Gentlemen, today is February 23rd, 2025, and we are here to talk about the world. Current events, foreign policy, you name it, we'll talk about it in another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello?
Yo.
Hey, how are you?
Doing pretty well. Yourself?
Can't complain.
Good. Well, I'm getting better from being sick. I was sick like 4 or 5 days ago, but today
Really?
I'm pretty much full strength. Yeah, I had like the usual fever plus cough. Nothing too crazy. Just your winter cold stuff. But it warmed up today. It got to a high of 50, so it felt very warm relative to how it's been.
Well, how much better has it gotten?
A lot. It got to negative 32 Fahrenheit at the low point. That's like a weird, spooky, not even the house can keep the cold out situation. So I'm glad that that's over, and it should be warming up towards springtime now. So I'm happy. And we had a really epic week of streams. Lots of big ones. My solo honor mode run is still intact. Picked up Minthara. She decided to quit being a paladin and start punching people as a monk. So, business is good.
Clara.
Yeah.
She doesn't seem all that monkish to me.
Well, I can make it up in my head if I want to, but the
Sure.
real reason was Karlak used to be my monk. I wanted to have a monk in the party, and for different voice actors, they'll actually voice act the different moves of different classes, even if that's not canon for how they start out when they give it to you. And some of them make very silly sounds when they punch things, so that's always something you can experiment with. There's the punching vocalizations that they'll do, and then if you spec them into a bard, you get to hear the voice actor do the vicious mockery voice lines, and those are kind of drawn randomly from a set. So I have Shadowheart as our vicious mockery expert as a sword bard. Yep, that's in Act 2. We're fighting the Shadow Curse and so on. It's a good time.
How's that going?
The Githyanki patrol that's on that bridge is very scary. That's probably the scariest fight that I've had in Act 2 so far. Those guys just hit so hard. They all have psionic jump. They jump across the screen. The crossbowmen kill you in like 2 shots. But we lived it.
Yeah, they're pretty tough.
Mm-hmm.
They're pretty tough.
Yep, South Dakota's been...
exciting?
It's been cool, like, getting to know a local community, because this is a smaller town, so...
Yeah.
Just networking with people. It feels like the stakes are higher in a sense, because if you don't get along well with someone or something bad happens, then the town knows forever. Which there isn't the pressure like that when you're on a big city format like LA or Dallas Fort Worth or something. There's just so many people that even if you rub somebody the wrong way, like no one cares or knows because you're just lost in the sea of people. But if you're in a city or a town with hundreds to thousands of people, then it's a lot more like, oh, this happened? Okay. No pressure.
Best behavior.
Yeah. They seem like nice people and down to earth. South Dakotans are very tough because the weather is so harsh. So they're people who absolutely would not complain about the cold weather or like circumstances of the environment. They'll vent about it a little bit, but they'll certainly put up with a lot and still choose to stubbornly live here. So,
Well, how are the amenities up there?
there's a lot of outdoorsy things that you can do in the warmer seasons. So once spring starts, a lot of people will go out and climb and do stuff like that. They have a lot of trails and national parks. If you've seen the sites like Crazy Horse Monument and Mount Rushmore, you've kind of seen most of the constructed monuments. The towns are cool. There are huge motorcycle rallies here in the summer. So it's a very, very high population place certain times. Great restaurants if you're into that. The local crafted stuff is reasonably cool. There's a lot of Native American history here. But yeah.
Yeah, you were talking about the Lakota last time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was hearing about that, and I think they were saying that Lakota or Dakota is what they were called by other tribes, which mean that name means the enemy or something. So,
Oh yeah, the Sioux. Yeah.
yeah, Sioux. But yeah, I'm looking forward to doing the Crazy Horse Run again. They host, it's like either a walk or a jog or run. You pick your pace, and it's not timed or anything, but they let you go on this cool trail route around the Crazy Horse Monument. And there's this one Native American dude who is running it multiple times, and it's like a 10-kilometer route. So he's definitely athletic if he's doing a 10-kilometer route multiple times in the day. And he carries a backpack with a speaker, and he's playing Native American music on it. So definitely gave people lots of smiles and stuff. But I want to meet him next time on the run, because I went to one of them so far, but they hold them twice a year.
Good on you for getting out.
Yeah.
I'm not much for running.
Yeah, you can walk it. It's a walkable one, too. Most people walk it.
That's more my speed.
Yeah.
Well, really, sitting in my office chair is more my speed, but as far as things I'm physically capable of, walking is more available as an activity than, say, running.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how far I'd get if I tried to run these days.
Maybe farther than you think if you're being chased by a cave bear.
I don't know, man. I might just accept it. That might be easier. I had a good run. It's fine. You can eat me.
You could parlay with the cave bear and say, "You don't want to eat me. I have a horrible diet. You should eat that person. They look like they're healthy."
Well, here's the thing. Having a horrible diet in America means you eat lots of sweet stuff.
Oh, true.
So you may actually taste pretty decent, assuming bears like sugar and sweet taste anyway.
Mm.
I don't really know what they like.
Yep. I hope you don't get eaten anytime soon, regardless of how you might taste.
Oh, I think I'm pretty safe. I live a very risk-averse life.
You're saying you don't live in bear country?
No. Not a lot of bears in Dallas these days.
There are black bears that roam around here, but they're not native. They'll just migrate over for a little bit if the weather's nice. But black bears are much more defensive of a type of bear compared to, say, a grizzly. Grizzly or a polar bear, just don't even try. But if it's a bear that can climb a tree, they can sometimes be persuaded to not fight by yelling at them. So there's your random wildlife tip. Stay safe, chat. Don't take park ranger advice from Twitch, and that means from me. Talk to your local park ranger if you're confused about bear etiquette. Well, how's the world been? I know we tackled a lot of US stuff last time, but there was so much of a backlog because I didn't stream for a month that we didn't really get to any of the world stuff, but it's been a pretty active start of the year from what you were saying.
Yeah, there's quite a bit. Well, it's mostly for the United States. The rest of the world is kind of going on and has their own things going on, but definitely the circus in Washington has been the leading headline, not only in the United States, but much of the world. Everybody's kind of wondering how much they should be hedging their bets, because it's not entirely clear how serious the administration is about some of the more dramatic pronouncements that they've made over the course of the past month. So that's kind of the big question right now. I imagine over the next couple of months, that's kind of going to get sorted out. For now, everything is very uncertain. And that makes everybody very anxious, and correspondingly, it's all anybody can really talk about.
Mm-hmm.
So would you prefer to start with, I had it categorized, like I mentioned last time. So I've got trade policy. We'll do foreign policy for sure, because that's the main thing we didn't do last time. So I have it categorized according to just general foreign policy and trade. So which would you prefer first?
Let's do trade, because people love talking about tariffs.
Oh, yeah. And I've got so much stuff, and I haven't even been able to get it all organized. So I've got as many details as I'm going to cram in here for today. If there's anything I miss, please let me know in chat. I'll throw out the usual disclaimer very early today. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. I've got more of a background in economics and foreign policy. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do let me know. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is encouraged in that regard. I won't read chat while we do this because I can't walk and chew bubblegum at the same time, but I will get the feedback eventually when I read through it. And we do enjoy the feedback we get on here. So, and to be clear, you haven't been following any of this for the past month, right?
Correct.
Okay. Where to start? So for maybe the first week, I don't think there was that much trade stuff going on. And then I think around the second week, it all kind of came very quickly over the course of the first couple of days, like Monday through Wednesday or whenever it was. At first, it seemed like there wouldn't be that much action in terms of tariffs. And I should maybe do a little background here. Donald Trump, in terms of public policy, vis-a-vis trade as an issue, is very protectionist, or at least he pretends to be. There's a whole debate about whether or not he even really means what he says when he says that he's going to be a protectionist. Some people argue that it's just a negotiating tactic designed to get concessions. Other people say that he actually is protectionist. It's kind of an ongoing debate. I'm very much in the kayfabe side of that. I don't think it's real. And I don't even really think there's substantive concessions that he's going after. I think it's mostly just theater meant to appease voters. I don't think there's substantive public policy there. But again, that's where the debate is. But in general, he's seen as protectionist. And so both after the first time he was elected in 2016 and then this time, the big question is, how protectionist is he going to be? And given how important the United States is to the global economy, significant increases in American tariffs have the potential to make significant waves in the global economy that could be very disruptive. So that's what everybody's been watching for, and so that's the significance of all this. So at first, all he did was issue an executive order directing federal agencies to investigate and address trade deficits and unfair trade and currency practices. There were no new tariffs involved in that executive order. It just sounded like a report. And so it seemed then, given that was pretty much all he did for the first week, like maybe he wasn't actually going to follow through on some of the more dramatic stuff that he said he would do while he was campaigning. Just blanket high tariffs against China, punishment, punitive tariffs against, allies for perceived unfairness, unfair trade practices. All of this kind of stuff is what people were really watching for in terms of his early trade policy. And the early executive order kind of discounted that. It made it seem more like some of the advisors who had come out while he was campaigning saying that it was just a negotiating tactic and not to take it too seriously, were right. So that kind of calmed markets for a while and people kind of shifted focus to other things. And then he actually did start making threats. So it seemed the early executive order was not really indicative, representative of what he would actually do on this issue. Or so it seemed. We'll get into that. The next thing that happened was the World Economic Forum, where he gave a speech, and he threatened, quote unquote, trillions of dollars in tariffs on foreign imports. And he also said to audible gasps among the crowd at the forum that Trump said Canada could become a U.S. state to avoid the trillions of dollars in tariffs. I think it's pretty clear that was just shit talking on his part. He's well known for cheap talk. But at the same time, it started a big kerfuffle with Canada and in Canada. And, if you haven't been following this, there's been kind of a big surge in anti-American sentiment in Canada, stemming not only from that statement, but also the subsequent tariff kerfuffle, which I'm about to start on. But Canada has not been amused by all of this going on, be it cheap talk or not. It's aggravated significant numbers of people there. And it's worth pointing out that Canada has an election coming up, and so it's actually impacted that as well. We might talk about that later if people are interested in it. So what exactly has Trump done tangibly, other than these big, statements? So what he did is he announced kind of out of the blue that there would be 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada starting on February the 1st, right? So this was like the big significant policy move. And it would involve slightly lower tariffs on Canadian oil and natural gas, since the United States buys a lot of those. And part of Trump's campaign involved promising, lower energy prices and higher energy production. And of course, if you're taxing a significant source of your energy imports, that's not going to happen. So broad 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada, except for Canadian oil and natural gas, for that reason. And the quid pro quo early on, and this was an early indicator that he wasn't really serious about just being full protectionist, is that he said that he would waive the tariffs basically in exchange for action on certain areas. And the two that came up repeatedly, and I think we've even talked about this before, was immigration and fentanyl. He has stated that Canada and Mexico don't do enough to fight fentanyl smuggling into the United States. And he also says that they don't do enough to prevent illegal immigration into the United States. Now, that position makes some sense with regard to Mexico. It really doesn't make any sense with regard to Canada, because Canada is not a significant source for either fentanyl or immigrants into the United States, or at least not illegal immigrants. So it's not entirely clear, or at least it wasn't entirely clear, why Canada was kind of getting thrown in with Mexico in that regard. So that was the early announcement. That was what the Trump administration said that they wanted to do. We're going to tariff you unless maybe you work with us on certain areas. So there were some talks, and it was announced that the tariffs would be delayed until March 1st. And that kind of calmed markets, because obviously everybody was very excited, after that sudden announcement. The negotiations that happened did not result in substantive concessions on the part of either the US or Mexico. Mexico basically promised to deploy troops to the border with the United States to try to intercept more caravans, illegal immigrants basically, and also agreed to cooperate more with the United States on fentanyl. Canada, for its part, did something similar. They announced that they would create a new position that would basically be a czar of anti-fentanyl smuggling. And they also announced more money would be spent on policing the border. The thing about the Canadian proposal is that it had already been announced in December. And so they basically just repackaged it as a concession here. This is pretty much exactly what I said would happen, months ago when we were talking about how the Trump administration would conduct its policy. They would try to take credit for things that were already happening or that were otherwise artificial, basically create artificial concessions to try to make themselves look like they were accomplishing something. That's not to say that they would do that in every endeavor of the administration, but in terms of trade, that's what they did during the first term, and that's exactly what I expected them to do in the second term. And so far, that's exactly what they've done. So the early tariffs here early tariff threats didn't amount to anything. Basically, he just wanted some superficial concessions that he could frame as a win, and then he would move on. It's technically true that the tariffs have only been delayed for a month, but my expectation is that they'll just end up getting delayed again, and that basically this will just be a recurring thing in which the administration pretends to threaten Mexico and Canada, and then they pretend to cooperate. Again, just a kind of kayfabe. Canada and Mexico, for their part, when they were threatened with the tariffs, they started drawing up retaliatory tariffs. They obviously didn't have to end up implementing them because of the negotiations. But I thought it was notable that when the Canadian government announced what their retaliatory tariffs would look like, the Trump administration released a statement saying that the Canadian government was misunderstanding the situation. I think the quote I have from the article is that the White House said on Monday it has a notice that Mexico is serious, quote unquote, about President Donald Trump's executive order on tariffs, but Canada has, quote unquote, misunderstood it to be a trade war between the neighboring countries. So again, that suggests to me, that seems to me to be evidence that the negotiations, indeed the threats themselves, were never really meant to be serious. This was just meant to be theater. It wasn't meant to be taken seriously. I think the Mexican government kind of understood that a little better, which is why while they did announce that there would be retaliatory tariffs, they didn't really release details about them, and they focused more on the negotiations, whereas the Canadian government actually seemed to be positioning itself for a real confrontation. And I don't think a real confrontation is what Washington wanted, which is why they said that Canada was kind of misunderstanding, quote unquote, the situation. Let's see. Early on, he also announced some threats that we weren't really sure about, about new tariffs on steel and aluminum, and then also tariffs on things like chips. We'll kind of get into that a little bit later, but again, this was just early days. This was like the second week, and he just kind of mentioned these things in passing, but nobody really knew for sure what he meant by it or what he would actually do about it. So that was the first big kerfuffle in terms of trade. The next one had to do with shipping, specifically with de minimis rules. These are rules that basically waive customs duties on packages that are under a certain value. So basically, historically, if the packages were worth less than $800, then the sender did not have to pay any kind of customs duty in order to get them into the United States. If the package is worth more than $800, then there actually would have to be normal customs procedures, like a review, a duty that you would have to pay, et cetera. And the criticism of this is that Chinese companies, I think Shein and Temu are the main ones, kind of took advantage of them, or well, maybe not took advantage, but just used them as intended, to ship a lot of cheap stuff into the United States. Basically the business model of these companies is extreme customization. They'll just produce a whole bunch of stuff, and then based off of data, very short-term data on who's buying them, they'll scale up or down accordingly. And it's heavily based off of individual orders directly to factories. And that being the case, almost all of their orders are sent out to individuals rather than to wholesalers, which would generally involve shipping in bulk. So because they're shipping to individuals, they can take advantage of this rule, which avoids customs duties, which wholesalers cannot avoid. If you're a wholesaler and you're shipping like large amounts of stuff, you have to pay customs duties. There's pretty much no getting around it. But Shein and Temu, because they had this unusual business model, they were able to circumvent that. And some people had argued that that was unfair, that basically they had free access to the US market that other companies were not subject to. And so a number of people who have been very critical of China, and more specifically, the coupling of the Chinese and American economies, have been arguing for some years that the de minimis rule should be changed. So what happened then is that the Trump administration announced that packages from China would no longer be subject to this. Basically, at first they actually blocked packages from China outright. But I think the intention was to eventually exempt China from the de minimis rule. In other words, that packages from China would be subject to customs duties regardless of the value. But initially they just started with an outright ban. And they actually ended up overturning that decision. And the reason was that it was just very disruptive, because it's not just Shein and Temu that ship stuff to the United States. There's a number of other Chinese manufacturers and businesses that do so, and American consumers, not just individual consumers, but also like American businesses and whatnot, they used those services, and being cut off from them just suddenly out of the blue was very disruptive to their operations. And of course they screamed bloody murder, and so the administration ended up walking it back. I have to think they'll end up returning to this later, but I would think that they'll do it more smartly. Basically, they'll actually have a process by which they go through, consult with the private sector, write up rules, and actually put some effort into drawing them up, and then have a transition period over which they'll be implemented. In other words, just normal good governance, the thing that they should have been doing in the first place. So this was the second kerfuffle. Let's see. So the newer stuff over the past 2 weeks has been an announcement about reciprocal tariffs. And that's their word. Apparently the idea here is that they want tariffs in the United States to be equal to tariffs on American goods in other countries. Because if you look at the tariff schedule in different countries, there are things that the United States has low tariffs on, but which partner countries have much higher tariffs on. So in Trump's mind, it's ideal that tariffs should be equalized, and that if other countries want to continue to enjoy low American tariffs, then they need to lower their tariffs as well. All of which sounds intuitively very good. And I'm sure there are some areas where there is perhaps some leverage to be used there to some kind of gain. I have no idea what it would be. The Trump administration does not communicate with the public very well as to what its true objectives are. But that is what they announced. And they did kind of highlight Vietnam in particular for some reason. There's a lot of Chinese goods that were diverted to Vietnam because of tariffs in the first Trump term, and have continued to kind of siphon through Vietnam as a third-party re-exporter since then. So that might be something that they're looking at. I think the critique here basically is that the reason that there's different levels of tariffs between countries, sometimes it's just random noise, sometimes it's just random bullshit. But a lot of the time it's actually negotiated. Over the course of the past half century plus, basically the post-war era, a number of trade agreements have been negotiated over that time span. And very frequently, talks have gotten hung up on this, that, or the other particular interest by a particular industry or political group or lobbying group or whatever, in this, that, or the other country, be it in the United States or in a partner country. And so generally, the compromises that were drawn up involved some give and take in terms of tariffs. So they were not entirely reciprocal as a result, but the payoff in the long run was a trade agreement, which everybody benefited from. So in some cases, if you try to undo some of these non-reciprocal tariffs that exist, you're actually going to upend an existing trade agreement, or at least the informal part of an existing trade agreement, which is going to trigger some degree of retaliatory tariffs on the part of the other partner country. And those corresponding retaliatory tariffs will not be with regard to the good in question. They'll regard some other good that Europe had agreed to relatively low tariffs on as a quid pro quo in exchange for American tariffs being low on a particular other set of goods, so that they could come to an eventual agreement. That's going to unwind basically if they do this. So they have to be very careful. And, given that it's the Trump administration, I'm not entirely confident that they're going to be careful. I have a sneaking suspicion they're going to do what they've been doing for the first month, which is just applying a blanket announcement here that just completely overturns the existing status quo, and then tries to replace it with something not somewhat, but very haphazardly, generally with very disruptive consequences. And that in the end will probably end up very much in a place that is very much similar to where we started. Another problem with this approach is that there's a lot of individual tariffs. They're talking about individual tariffs on individual goods and systematically going through all of them in each partner country that the United States trades with, and checking to make sure they're reciprocal and if they're not, implementing new ones. Now, the statistic I read is that there's over 1 million such individual tariffs. And keep in mind, this is grand total, right? We're talking, this is grand total all items for which you can tariff. Now, keep in mind that you have to do that. You have to review 1 million tariffs for each trading partner to make sure that they're reciprocal. And then if not, then you're going to have to implement what are going to probably be hundreds of thousands of individual changes to the tariff schedule in the United States in order to make them reciprocal. And that's a big administrative load, right? You need a lot of administrative capacity to do that. And the government doesn't really have that. It can do it, but it's going to take a while. It's going to take months, maybe even years, depending on how many resources they dedicate to doing this. So I suspect if they're actually serious about systematically going through the entire tariff schedule for every trading partner, it's going to take a very long time. And we may not hear about this again for, some maybe until the end of the Trump administration. But I think more likely here is that they're just trying to use this for a very specific set of goods that the administration has in mind, and that they want to use it as leverage to get something. Again, it could be a totally superficial concession that they're after. A lot of this could easily just be more theater, which is pretty much my expectation. But again, it's impossible to say for sure. And so, like I said at the top, everybody's hedging their bets, and there's a lot of uncertainty resulting from this. So, we'll see how it plays out in the end.
Yeah, some people in chat are already buzzing about, is this all a big revenge against Canada for beating us in hockey recently?
No.
Okay.
And they didn't really beat us in hockey per se. That was an all-star game thing. You're familiar with the all-star game and in the NHL,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So they decided not to do that this year, and instead they created a new format where they split all of the big players into 4 different national teams. Mm-hmm. I think it was the U.S., Canada, Finland, and Sweden. Not Russia, because of obvious reasons. Mm-hmm. And so they decided to have a tournament between the different teams. So that's really what it was. The media played it up because that's what the NHL wanted. It was basically an attempt to grab attention. And, unsurprisingly, it was very effective and particularly well-timed. I don't know if they timed it like that on purpose or not, but it certainly worked out very well for them. But that said, it wasn't like a real international competition. It was basically just a publicity stunt by the NHL. But yes, technically, Team Canada did beat Team USA. And of course, a number of politicians in Canada crowed considerably about that.
But that's not why we're tariffing them.
Correct.
I guess that's one of the things that is coming up for me, is why tariff so many people all of a sudden? Is it just like a strongman move where it looks like we ain't going to take shit from nobody anymore, you take some tariffs? But what does it actually achieve? What's the advantage?
Well, like I said, it's not entirely clear what the end point is for all of this. If the early tariffs announced on Canada and Mexico are any indication, then it's just theater. The administration wants partner countries to appear to give substantive concessions so that the administration can go to the media here in the United States and boast about accomplishments, basically score political points. This is something they did a lot in the first Trump term. That's something I expected to happen here, and it seems to be happening again. So, as we've discussed previously on here, a lot of foreign policy is actually driven not so much by realpolitik or, competition between states. It's actually driven more by domestic political considerations, very frequently. That is the case. And the Trump administration really epitomizes that, because for them, foreign policy kind of more is an arena where the United States has lots of leverage, and to their minds, that leverage should be used to try to get concessions that make them look good domestically. I think some countries abroad understand this better than others. I should say some governments abroad understand this better than others. So, the governments that understand it generally avoid confrontation with the United States, specifically because if you're out of sight, you're out of mind. And the administration doesn't want them to involve you in any of its sort of kayfabe nonsense. The ones that don't really fully understand it, I think, are, one, signaling that they're concerned, scared, and want to hedge, and then learn kind of the hard way that that's not really an effective means of getting ahead, basically. Again, Canada was legitimately concerned about the tariff threat that the Trump administration made early on, and then, like I said earlier, the Trump administration kind of had to calm them down and say, just play along. This isn't a big deal. We're just going to come to some agreement, and you're going to do a bunch of stuff you were already doing, and then it goes away. So domestic political considerations is the real answer. I think maybe some people abroad may be a little resistant to that notion, because that's the kind of logic you would expect from a state like, Russia or some other, developing country state. It's not something you would normally associate with politics in a developed country. But they're going to have to get used to it, because that is what's happening here. The Trump administration is known for being very theatrical. And the sooner you internalize that and bake that into your foreign policy calculations, the better off you're going to be. Because there's no sense running against the grain and trying to negotiate with them like these pronouncements are like full-on serious. They're not. A lot of the administration's foreign policy announcements are just cheap talk meant for domestic consumption. In so much as they're not, they are occasionally designed to kind of shock other countries into giving concessions. But once you kind of know how the game works, you know that you don't really have to worry too much about that. There is a kind of a normal negotiating process that happens once you get into a room with some of the top level officials. I still don't know that the top level officials really have a great plan in mind or a clear end state. It's not entirely clear just how well organized the Trump administration is internally. It was famously disorganized in his first term. It's better organized this time, if only because Susie Wiles is his chief of staff and is known for being a very competent leader in that regard. But it still remains to be seen just how much better it really is, and whether or not Susie Wiles can actually kind of herd the cats of the administration's leadership. He famously prefers to hire big egos, and those people can be very, very difficult to coordinate. So, basically that's just kind of a long-winded way of saying that we don't entirely know what the administration's end state is, and maybe that the administration itself sometimes doesn't know, and that it's just fishing for concessions when it makes big, belligerent announcements. But in general, thus far, the evidence suggests that it's just domestic posturing that they're going for. And in so much as that's the case, a lot of this isn't really meaningful. It's just theater. So that said, another point regarding reciprocal tariffs and the announcements that have been made on that, I thought it was really telling that one of the things they talked about when they announced what they wanted to do was not just that they were not only going to look at individual tariffs on individual goods, they would also consider raising American tariffs in response to what they saw as non-tariff barriers to trade. Now, that particularly caught my eye, because it's one thing to say that tariffs should be equal between countries, but it's very much another thing to say that non-tariff barriers need to be removed. That's kind of beyond the pale a little bit. And when I say beyond the pale, it's normal historically, even in the free trade era, for countries to kind of snipe at each other about differing levels of tariffs and to negotiate them. But generally, non-tariff barriers were something that was negotiated separately, because non-tariff barriers is basically a euphemism for regulations. And how individual states regulate individual industries is a matter of sovereignty. It's their sovereign right to regulate industries in their economy, in their countries, however they want. And so non-tariff barriers, as a result, tend to be a very sensitive negotiating issue in the trade negotiations. Individual countries tend to be very reluctant to effectively trade away some degree of sovereignty over the regulation of given industries in exchange for what is called regulatory alignment, which is when different states agree to regulate a given industry in the same way. Now, that could be very useful. Regulatory alignment actually does significantly improve access to foreign markets. Because even if tariffs are low, individual traders, manufacturers, whatever, in a country can still find learning a whole other country's bureaucracy and navigating that successfully to be very daunting and difficult, to the point where a lot of them don't even try, unless they know that there's like a big market there, or they have some partner in that market that already knows the bureaucracy and is willing to help them. So that's actually why a lot of modern free trade agreements tend to focus disproportionately on regulatory alignment. In the negotiations, lowering tariffs is generally the easy part. The much harder part is regulatory alignment, getting rid of all the non-tariff barriers to trade of one kind or another. So for the Trump administration to go out and want to declare jihad on different tariffs, no shock. That's well within their wheelhouse. And that's not even necessarily outside the bounds of normal trade negotiations, but announcing that you're really going to punish other states for not regulating their economies the way that you like, that's probably going to generate a lot of pushback. Unless he's willing to really actually engage in substantive non-tariff barrier negotiations about regulatory alignment in a traditionalist vein, then this is probably just going to go nowhere. He can be as belligerent as he wants, but it's all just going to be cheap talk until he actually kind of tips his hand and reveals whether or not he's willing to give some kind of concessions to get that. And if not, then other countries are just going to blow him off. And it doesn't matter how much he's going to threaten them about that. That's just too sensitive politically for leaders in other countries to give ground on without being punished politically by their own voters. So keep your eye on that. That's going to be an interesting space to watch.
It seems like a very costly theater if it is such, in terms of just how our global reputation shifts.
Well, the Trumpian argumentation there is that the United States has lots of leverage and that we can get away with it. Even if other countries don't like it, even if they're put off by it, even if they want to hedge to be less dependent on the United States, the US economy is just so big, and so many economies abroad have so many ties to it that there's really only so much that they can resist. So the idea here is to kind of really use that leverage to lean on other countries to give substantive concessions. Like I said, though, even if you have leverage, there's a limit to what you can get for it. For something politically sensitive, states will push back, and they'll even take a trade hit if they have to in order to preserve themselves politically, that is to say. And, there's also a political cost to be seen giving in to a bully. That's a big thing in Canadian politics right now. When the United States really started pressuring them, or pretending to, as I think is the case, a lot of Canadians were very offended by that, and they started demanding that their government stand up to the United States. So even though the United States has clear-cut leverage over Canada, any Canadian government that is seen as being too conciliatory is going to be punished, because they'll be seen as giving into a bully and inviting further aggression in future. And so this is significant because it has actually had some impact on the Canadian election. It really seemed like the Conservatives were going to kind of cruise to a victory in the upcoming Canadian election. But since all of the drama with the Trump administration unfolded, there's kind of been a surge in nationalism and a skepticism of political parties and ideologies that are seen as adjacent to Trump and the Republican Party in the United States, which kind of is where the Conservatives in Canada are right now. And so while there hasn't been a huge swing in the polls, there is kind of a bump to the Liberal Party. They're in a stronger position than they were. And I think the polling that I was reading was that if they elect this one particular leader, I think his name is Carney or something, somebody in chat probably knows. But if they replace Trudeau with that guy, then they stand a much stronger chance of winning the upcoming election. And that would be a big turnaround for them, because they have not had momentum thus far in the election. It kind of seemed like they were just living on borrowed time, but this kerfuffle with the United States has given them new life. So, that's all, again, a result of a surge in Canadian nationalism, which has extended to the booing of the U.S. national anthem proceeding during the singing of the American national anthem in hockey games.
Yeah, the chat mentioned that.
Yeah, I would add a kind of further note there on Canadian elections. It may be that the Canadian government actually knew from the start that the United States was just kind of bluffing, that it was all just kayfabe theater bullshit, but played it up anyway because the Trudeau government wanted to try to generate some political points for the Liberal Party in Canada for the upcoming election. That's kind of borderline conspiracy theory. I can't really prove that, but it actually does make some sense. Standing up to the United States is invariably going to be popular in Canada, especially with the Trump administration being belligerent. So that definitely helps them in terms of political theater. And so they may have well leaned into the political theater in that regard. I'm not Canadian, so I welcome input from people who actually live there and are more familiar with the politics on that. But that is something I was kind of thinking about while I was watching the whole thing unfold. Yeah, there's another tangent I could go on there. In general, the political left, and I define here the political left in the European sense, sort of the European left-wing statists, more socialist, versus European conservative, where you fight for a smaller state, individual rights, social conservatism, etc. So that traditional left-right dynamic, which more defines politics in either European countries or countries descended from European populations and whatnot. In general, the left-wing political movements and parties in different countries tend to get along with each other internationally. They don't tend to have a lot of friction. They tend to have more of an internationalist outlook. And some of that stems from, historical roots in socialist labor movements, which kind of saw labor as transcending nationality, race, creed, etc. By contrast, right-wing movements and parties don't tend to get along internationally. They actually tend to kind of butt heads a lot. Obviously, they don't entirely get along with the left-wing parties either, but unlike the left-wing parties, they don't really have a unifying ideology. And so the result is that when you see this kind of broad-based emergence of right-wing political parties across multiple countries at once, it generally augurs some degree of friction. The exception there would be the UK and the United States. In the 1980s, they both had conservative governments at the time, but of course, the obvious issue there is that the United States and the United Kingdom are very, very similar culturally. If you look at conservative governments that sprung up in places like, say, Hungary, for example, over the past 10 years, they tend to be more antagonistic, not only to the left-wing parties that they see as being, anti-traditionalist, anti-sovereign, etc., but they also kind of butt heads with other conservative movements because other conservative movements have objectives that are frequently at odds with those of Hungarian nationalists. So Hungarian nationalists, for example, believe that Hungary was abused after World War I and that it lost disproportionately large tracts of territory as a result of the peace that ended World War I. And they've been kind of obsessing over that for much of the past 100 years. And correspondingly, they kind of low-key want land that belongs currently to neighboring states. And however much they may have in common in terms of reverence for traditional values with conservative parties in those neighboring states, the fact that they want the land is a problem. So, for example, Romania has a big chunk of territory, Transylvania, which has a large Hungarian minority. Hungarian nationalists want that back. And they even have these maps of a sort of greater Hungary that includes Transylvania that they'll wear on T-shirts and stuff. I remember there was like a big scandal when Orban went to some high-profile meeting wearing one of these T-shirts, and everybody kind of gave him shit for it. And this has tangible consequences. There's a big conservative bloc of parties in the European Parliament, which encompasses a wide variety of nationalist movements and parties, and very frequently they'll kind of clash with each other. Because of these kinds of competing claims, these sort of traditional historical grievances, to the point where a number of these parties have had to be ejected from the main conservative coalition in the European Parliament, and they've had to kind of form their own bloc outside of either the left or right-wing traditional bloc in the European Parliament. So the reason I bring this up is that Trump kind of epitomizes this, because on the one hand, he kind of is evidence that these sort of alternative fringe political movements, populist, if you like, these populist movements can actually succeed and that they can get into power and operationalize their agenda into tangible public policy. So, a lot of populist movements in Europe kind of like him for that reason. But the flip side is that when Trump puts pressure on, say, Canada or Europe or just any other country, invariably that casts a poor light on his sort of adjacent populists. Populists in those countries are seen as kind of being implicitly allied with Trump. And that makes it a little harder for those parties to gain popularity because they're seen as kind of sellouts, basically. So a similar process to what played out in Canada has actually happened in Europe. Some of these populist parties that had been kind of gaining ground now find themselves in a little bit of trouble because now Trump is kind of giving them a bad name and is undermining their sort of credibility as a real alternative that has the best interests of their country at heart. Because, how can you have the best interest of the country at heart if you're kind of aligned with this foreign aggressor that's putting pressure on you? Now, obviously, that's a simplification. There's going to be nuances and whatnot. Obviously, there's going to be disagreements between nationalists of one kind or another. But this is kind of a hurdle. I wanted to highlight this as a hurdle that they're going to face. There's going to be more sort of Canada situations that play out in other countries. This may have already happened in Germany. Germany had an election, I think, yesterday or today. And the early results are saying that the populist political parties, specifically the AfD, didn't do quite as well as expected. And so some of these early confrontations with the United States may have played some role in that. Of course, there's invariably other factors at play too. Of course, there's been a big pushback to the prospect that the populists could gain significant political traction as a result of the election. So there was a lot of mobilization and whatnot. But this is going to be a recurring theme. The more pressure that Trump applies to other places, the more he's going to empower those political forces in those places that are seen as the most opposed to him. So call that an unintended consequence, if you like. Let's see, what else did we have here? Reciprocal. Okay, we got through the reciprocal stuff. Oh, another note on the reciprocal tariffs, and this could kind of apply to others. The legality of the Trump administration just imposing tariffs on other countries because their tariffs are not, well, because their tariff on an individual good is perhaps higher than the corresponding American tariff on that good. That's not really legal per se. The executive branch of the United States does not actually have the power to do that. Technically, the power to set tariffs is exclusively a congressional power. However, Congress can delegate that power if it so chooses, and there are a couple of acts and laws that do exactly that, which is what the Trump administration is going to be using in order to implement these tariffs if and when they actually do them. So, one of these is Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974. Another one is Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930. And then, of course, there's every president's favorite, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which kind of gives broad-based discretionary authority to set tariffs and whatnot. Now, the problem with these laws, in so much as these are the main ones that the administration is going to use, is that while they do give discretionary authority to the president to set tariffs, they only give that discretionary authority in particular circumstances, and it's not entirely clear that the current administration is going to be able to find those circumstances for every individual case of a good or of a tariff that it wants to reciprocate. So, for example, the Trade Act of 1974, specifically Section 122, that allows a flat rate maximum of 15%. A tariff of 15%, but only for 6 months. So it's not permanent. So if that's the authority the administration uses, then the threat is not really entirely credible because the counterparty is going to know that it's going to be over in 6 months anyway. Section 338, Tariff Act 1930, it provides the authority to act against trade discrimination that disadvantages U.S. commerce. The issue with this one is that it's never actually been used. And so it's not entirely clear-cut just how much authority the president has been granted via this law. So on the face of it, it sounds like a clear case here where the administration would be able to reciprocate tariffs. But there's probably going to be a lot of lawsuits that come out of that, and they're going to kind of get into the weeds of the law, and they may well end up clipping the administration's wings, depending on the details of it. And with the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, technically there does have to be some kind of emergency. And it's debatable whether or not another country having higher tariffs on something that the United States have really constitutes an emergency. So the administration can threaten to arbitrarily increase or decrease tariffs as it wants, but it does have to do so according to the law. And the legal levers that are available to it with regard to the reciprocal tariffs threat do not necessarily give him the authority to follow through on it. So that could undermine the administration's credibility in so much as it's even trying to make credible threats. Again, I have to keep coming back to it. I don't think the administration is really serious about a lot of this. Again, I think a lot of it is just theater. But, if we do take it at face value, which a lot of other states kind of have to, if only for public policy, if only for, appearance's sake, these threats do have issues with them once you actually start looking into the details. So we'll see. They may actually successfully argue that they do have the power to make these kinds of arbitrary tariff changes, but it's not some undisputed thing that they're just going to be able to do. Like, again, this is something that is going to be scrutinized heavily. Okay, so the next kerfuffle in the Trump trade policy in the Trump administration vis-a-vis trade was steel and aluminum. So on February 9th, the administration announced blanket steel and aluminum tariffs of 25%. And he also stated very explicitly that exemptions to this tariff, which were pretty widely granted to a number of industries, undermined its intended effect. And of course, the intended effect is that there would be more steel and aluminum production inside the United States, supplanting and replacing imported steel and aluminum, presumably generating more jobs and economic development in the United States. It's not entirely clear what the end game is here. Again, there's the stated intended effect of trying to reshore more steel and aluminum. The issue with that argumentation, though, is that the first Trump administration, in the first term, already did this. They already did blanket steel and aluminum tariffs. They started with individual countries and then kind of expanded it. And they ended up ending that. They reversed that. And they did so because they negotiated with all of the different countries that were affected. What was it called? Quotas. They had quota agreements that limited the amount of steel that could be imported into the United States. So it could be that that's actually the plan here. You know, if I'm right about the administration being more about theatrics in terms of its trade policy, they're going to threaten to implement this tariff. They may actually go through with it for some period of time, but then over the course of maybe the next month or couple months, they'll end up negotiating a quota agreement and then repackaging that as some kind of big win, some big concession on the part of trade partners, when really it just replaces the pre-existing quota agreement that had already been in place. And that was largely, I think, maintained through the Biden administration, I believe. Thought I had that in my notes somewhere, but I guess not. But regardless, my expectation is that that's how it's going to end. This is probably just more theater on his part. I'll say, too, here, tariffs on steel and aluminum to try to generate economic growth in the United States is a bad idea. Because while you might, and I do emphasize might, successfully encourage investors to build capacity, steel and aluminum capacity in the United States, the result is going to be higher steel and aluminum prices regardless. And that's going to have very negative downstream effects on industries that consume steel and aluminum here. It's true that there's a decent number of jobs generated by steel and aluminum production, but there's way, way more that are in industries that consume steel and aluminum. And I'm talking here about American manufacturing firms. These are guys who are already in the United States generating jobs for Americans. Their business is hurt by higher prices for steel and aluminum, which means fewer jobs for them. Fewer jobs in those industries, less production, less output, less market share. Like, it's a net drain on most of the economy. These kinds of tariffs are only going to help one very specific industry. And in that sense, it's very self-defeating. It is a kind of reallocation of wealth into this one very well politically connected industry. So to kind of just briefly go through that, again, it's a structural disadvantage for U.S. manufacturing. You know, their costs are going to go up, and that's going to make their prices go up and make them less competitive, both domestically and internationally. And it's a structural advantage, in turn, for foreign competition. You know, they're not going to have to deal with higher priced steel and aluminum. They'll still have access to the international market where it's relatively cheap. And in turn, they'll have that cost advantage. And it's not even clear that this is going to increase substantively investment in U.S. steel and aluminum production. Something that a lot of people may not be aware of. I wasn't aware of this during the whole steel and aluminum kerfuffle in the first Trump administration. A lot of steel and aluminum is actually patented intellectual property. It's not actually a commodity for the most part. There is some low-quality forms of steel that basically is traded as a commodity. But the higher quality stuff is actually patented. It has formula that are patented and researched and whatnot by individual firms, and only they can make it. So that's a big problem, because if you raise tariffs and you don't have a domestic producer of that patented steel, then you're just going to have to pay more for it. With no hope of ever getting like a cheaper domestic alternative. You know, it's just going to get produced overseas and exported into the market still. So that's just a net loss. That is just a total net loss on the economy. You're not going to get any kind of significant increase in investment in the United States, because again, the material is patented. And there's not much incentive for the foreign producer to produce in the United States, because there's no competitor. in the United States who can produce it legally without violating the patent. So, this is kind of normal stuff for economists in terms of free trade research. This is all pretty standard stuff. Like most economists would tell you that in terms of the effect on the overall economy, it's negative. Now, if you have some other motive besides, improving the overall quality of the economy in terms of production, jobs, etc., it can make sense. That's why we have politics. If there is some other objective that is considered useful or valuable on the part of the voting public, then they can vote their way into policies like this, and it seems they want to. So, in that sense, it's fine, right? This is the public getting what it wants. But in terms of actually helping the economy, it's just not. So if that's the motive, you would be better off avoiding this. Okay, so the most recent drama, the stuff over the past week or two, the administration announced that they're going to consider additional tariffs on Canadian-made cars, which could be as high as 50 to 100%. So I don't know really how this ties into the other tariffs that were announced. Those were sort of just broad-based tariffs on everything imported from Canada. Those have been delayed. This seems to be some new tariff threat. Trump says, quote, that Canada stole the US car industry, end quote, which is just patented bullshit. It was the Canadian and the US car industries evolved together. They've always been intertwined. I mean, Ford started, their main factories anyway were located in Detroit, and they've always engaged in cross-border trade from the earliest days of the US auto industry. So, they didn't steal anything. It's industries evolve organically in the United States and Canada just because the industry was located close to the border, invariably just shared in the evolution of the industry. It's true that the Canadians do enjoy some cost advantages over the United States, stemming from their currency being somewhat less valued than the US dollar. But that's waxed and waned with time, and it's not the main reason. The lower costs is a factor, but also just path dependency, quality, etc. Like there's a variety of reasons Canadian producers have been able to enjoy a persistent hold on certain parts of the US auto supply chain. So just arbitrarily severing it isn't going to really be a big help to the United States, even over the long term. It's going to cause lots of disruption if it actually happens. Again, I don't think it will. But just speaking as an economist here, the overall impact is just going to be negative for both industries. It's going to mean that the supply chain is less efficient, more costly, for the same reasons, that steel and aluminum is going to have negative consequences on downstream consumers of it. If you just cut off all of these Canadian firms, there's going to be less competition in the US market. And in turn, all of the consumers of the stuff those suppliers made is going to have to pay higher costs and will in turn be less competitive, right? So free trade does help, right? Just because there's some negative consequences to free trade doesn't change the fundamental fact that overall it improves everybody's quality of life. It improves the overall economy, it improves the global economy. It is a net positive, regardless of the negative aspects. So again, the threat has been made. This is still a new one. It's not clear where they're going to go with it. My expectation is that there will be some kind of negotiation here. The Canadians in particular are upset about this one because the Trump administration itself renegotiated the NAFTA agreement into the CUSMA agreement, the Canada-US-Mexico agreement, which replaced NAFTA, but which was actually pretty much the same agreement as NAFTA with a few provisions changed. Again, that's just been the pattern. They're upset in particular because if the administration does carry out this threat, then there would be a clear-cut violation of the CUSMA agreement that the Trump administration itself previously negotiated. So that seems, from the Canadian perspective, if not also the Mexican perspective, to be just one, hypocrisy, two, also suggests that the United States is not a good faith negotiator and just can't really be trusted. Now, I think the United States government is aware of that, and I think, again, it's specifically because I think they're aware of that they're not really serious about this. I think they're going to try to extract some kind of bullshit concession from the Canadians, and then they'll put it to bed. They'll run it through the US media cycle, pretend that they did a good thing, and then they'll move on to the next bullshit. Digital. This is kind of one that's been on again, off again for 10 years now. Famously, the European single market is much more stringent about regulating industries of one kind or another. They tend to be much more intrusive. Sometimes it's a good thing, sometimes it's not. It's a trade-off. Again, that's what politics is for. But in terms of digital regulation, there's been some tension with the United States because most large digital firms, Amazon, Facebook, etc., those tend to be American. And so anything Europe does to regulate digital spaces as a result of the fact that Americans are dominant there invariably means that it's going to appear discriminatory. It's going to disproportionately impact American firms, which allows Washington to basically levy the accusation that they're quote unquote targeting American firms. Now, it's a bullshit argument, but it's also one that the United States government has consistently made regardless of administration. The late Obama administration did this, the Trump administration did it, the Biden administration did it, and now the Trump administration in its second term is doing it again. So this isn't really a partisan thing per se. This is basically Washington trying to look out for its tech firms, which technically it's supposed to do. So you can't really call this a partisan thing. I can, however, critique the way they're doing it, which is to kind of just throw their weight around in the Trump style, which I don't think is going to be very useful here, since the European single market is one of the few that's kind of more or less on an equal footing with the United States in many ways, just in terms of economic heft. So that allows them to negotiate on a more equal footing and to kind of not worry so much about a lot of these threats, since they could hit back as hard as the Trump administration could hit them if it came to an out-and-out actual conflict. So there's not a whole lot of details on what the new Trump administration wants to do about digital, but they have been complaining about specifically the Digital Markets Act, which is a big landmark piece of European legislation. I should say the European Union legislation that angles to try to hold large tech firms more accountable. And it very much targets specifically large tech firms. There was a lot of consternation when they were consulting the private sector and the public about the new law, about whether it would affect small firms and put a disproportionate, if not crippling, regulatory burden on small firms. So in recognition of that, they've exempted pretty much all tech firms except the biggest. The way they've written the law, you basically have to be one of the big FANG firms in order to be impacted by this. But of course, that just makes it all the more easy for Washington to argue that they're deliberately targeting American firms. So this has just been back and forth like this for years. Again, this is not new. But everybody's looking here for hints about what the Trump administration specifically wants to do. There's no details yet, but they've kind of been ramping up the rhetoric steadily since Trump took office. The Munich speech that Vance gave, we'll definitely be getting into that later. But one of the things mentioned is that the Europeans are, strangling their digital sector and discriminating against American firms. Trump has said that reciprocal tariffs that we discussed before may encompass non-tariff barriers like, for example, the Digital Markets Act. And just recently, the House Judiciary Chair in the United States demanded, not very a diplomatic approach, he demanded that the EU antitrust chief, Teresa Ribera, clarify how she would be enforcing the European Union's rules reigning in big tech, again, specifically the DMA. So it's normal for this administration, as well as its allies in Congress, to be fairly confrontational. Again, that's their MO. That's how they deal with a lot of this. Mostly it's cheap talk, but you also can't completely assume it's always and forever cheap talk, since invariably there's going to be things the administration prioritizes as important and things it doesn't, but still wants to use for cheap talk and to generate headlines. So, as a counterparty, you always have to be on a kind of defensive crouch and kind of ready just in case Washington actually does kind of jump on you. That's kind of where we are with the DMA stuff right now. The EU doesn't know for sure if Washington really wants to go to bat for big tech companies. There's certainly a lot of big tech guys that have ties to Trump at this point. Famously, a lot of big billionaires have met with him over the past couple months and talked directly to him, and in one case is actually in the administration. So it may well be the case that that suggests the administration will go hard on this. However, they don't necessarily have a lot of leverage, because in this case, the European Union actually has relatively more to gain. I talked before how the Trump administration thinks that it can kind of get away with being belligerent because it has the leverage. But in Europe's case, they've actually, on this particular area, have relatively more leverage because they could hypothetically put curbs and blocks and whatnot on American tech firms and create space for European firms to replace them. This is kind of a reversal of the normal dynamic where the Trump administration is arguing that there should be more production of this, that, or the other thing inside the United States. The Europeans have a big deficit in terms of digital economy. They don't have a lot of big digital firms. So protectionism on their part in that regard might actually be useful. So I think for that reason, this isn't really going to go anywhere. And I think that's basically the reason it hasn't ever gone anywhere, even though multiple administrations now have complained about this. They have yet to really be able to generate or find the leverage that would be necessary to change Europe's course in this regard. So, if you're European, be grateful for the European Union and the single market, because that's giving you the leverage you need to kind of withstand this Trump tide of pressure. And if you're in the United States, don't worry about it. It's probably just theater anyway. But it's worth mentioning because this is probably something that's going to come up in any future broader negotiations, because Trump has said that he wants to target the European Union with tariffs. He hasn't really said explicitly what goods and services would be targeted. He doesn't really say even why he wants to target them. He's only really said that, the Europeans have treated us very unfairly. I think that's a direct quote. But other than that, there have been no details. So there could be a confrontation with Europe in the future, but he said the same thing in his first term and it never happened. And I think it's specifically because the Europeans have much more leverage than, say, a smaller country or group of countries would have. So other cheap talk that's come out of the administration, Trump said that he also wants to apply tariffs on cars. We kind of mentioned that with regard to Canada, but he also wants to do them specifically for semiconductors and pharmaceuticals. And recently he added lumber to the list for whatever reason. I have no idea why. Lumber has been kind of a sticking point in trade negotiations between the US and Canada for decades. It never really goes anywhere. Maybe he wants to try to solve that, I guess. I'm not sure. We'll see. Semiconductors has more to do, I imagine, with China. The Biden administration famously wanted to try to deal with the issue of tension with China, Sino-American competition, as it's been called, with his policy of having a high fence but small yard. Basically, the idea was to allow trade with China, but to heavily regulate trade with regard to very specific, sensitive strategic technologies. And among them was semiconductors. And one of the ways he wanted to deal with the semiconductor issue beyond just export controls was also through a big new industrial policy that would try to fund production of semiconductors inside the United States. Trump has been very critical of that approach. He's made the argument that it's very expensive to just pay billions of dollars in tax money to big semiconductor companies. His argument is that it would be much easier and cheaper just to have high tariffs on imported semiconductors so as to incentivize those firms to invest their own money to produce in the United States. So I think that's what he has in mind as far as these semiconductor tariffs. Whether or not he actually follows through with it, anybody's guess. But I suspect that's going to be more the logic. Pharmaceuticals, that one I'm particularly, well, I shouldn't say particularly confused by, but I'm not really sure what the end point is with that. The United States does depend a lot on imports from China for pharmaceuticals of one kind or another, or if not pharmaceuticals, then on what are called API, which are some of the base compounds that are used in pharmaceuticals. A lot of those come from China. Actually, even more API come from China than just general drugs, general pharmaceuticals. So it could be that he wants to try to reshore more of that production. That's my best guess. I don't know if there's some other motive yet. I would have to read more about it, but that's my best educated guess for the moment. But these are all things that you can look forward to future kerfuffles on: cars, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and apparently lumber. So that's pretty much all I had for trade. I had a list of individual industries kind of detailing how tariffs on Canada and Mexico would impact them in the United States, but since the tariffs didn't end up happening, it's kind of redundant. And at this point, I really don't think they're going to, so we could probably skip this unless somebody just really wants to get into the weeds here.
I'm just kind of processing everything and seeing that there's more of a if I'm breaking it down in terms of D&D conversation options, it's going for a bunch of intimidation rolls instead of persuasion rolls for things.
That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah. Because it's not really like, hey, I know things have been tough, but how can we smooth things over? It's like, you've been fucking with us, so now we're going to fuck with you. You better do what we like or else. It's more of that attitude. And it sounds like most of these tariff threats would take a lot of paperwork to actually enact them. So it's one of those things that we'll see what happens, what goes through.
Yeah. Again, it's still very early in the administration. It's going to take several months for us to really get a clear-cut idea of what the administration is actually trying to do and what it actually prioritizes. That's all very kind of up in the air right now. So this is all early impressions. If I sound confident about some of my prognoses, it's because I'm basing them more on stuff that happened in the first Trump administration, their first term. The precedent they set out is pretty clear-cut, and I've been predicting for some time that they would probably mostly adhere to that. And thus far, I feel like I've mostly been right, give or take a few details. So you're right that it is kind of more intimidation, and that can work, right? If you have a plan, then it can achieve substantive objectives. My criticism here is that there doesn't really appear to be substantive objectives. Like, it's not clear to me that the administration is like a clear-cut protectionist administration that is looking to return as much production and jobs into the United States as possible. That doesn't really seem to me to be the actual objective. It seems more like there are relatively mild changes that they want to make to the trading relationship the United States has with a number of countries, and that they're coming out strong to try to get as many of those concessions as possible. But that otherwise, in the end, it'll probably end up looking more like a normal trade agreement, even if the negotiations used to get there are actually just really belligerently stupid. Style over substance, put it like that.
To beat one's chest and feel strong.
So that's trade. In terms of general foreign policy, there's plenty more.
Cool. And just so you know, there are questions that have been passed along for today as well.
Should we do them now, or should we wait until later?
Yeah, you can do them now.
All right. So we'll take a brief break here from foreign policy and dig into some of the questions. I would like a pork taco update. I remember this. Okay, pork taco. So my prediction that I made when this question was first asked many months ago, and for those of you who are not aware of the lore here, I was asked some months ago what effect the incoming Trump administration would have in terms of its trade policy on pork taco prices. And my prediction was pretty accurate, I think. I didn't think that tariffs on Canada and Mexico would actually happen. So I didn't think that would have any bearing on pork taco prices. But I did say that tariffs on China would go through. Actually, I didn't mention China, did I? The Trump administration threatened 10% blanket tariffs on China at the same time that it threatened Canada and Mexico. Unlike with Canada and Mexico, though, the threat about 10% tariffs on China actually did get implemented. So that was not theater. But I also don't think that they had any particular end game for that. I think they just wanted to apply the tariff as a baseline because they kind of want to set the stage for further decoupling and then maybe also some negotiations. The first Trump administration was kind of torn about whether or not it just wanted to pressure China in the trading relationship so that it could get a better basically a better trading deal, a more even-footed trading relationship. That was one faction in the administration. The other faction just wanted full decoupling. They didn't even really care that much about the negotiations. Those were more for face for them. But those two factions fought continuously, and there was never really a clear-cut winner over time. I think the Hawks ended up kind of getting the upper hand near the end, but then they had to leave because they lost the 2020 election. In this new administration, it's not entirely clear what the balance of power is. And so I can't really prognosticate too much on just what the 10% tariff, what the significance of the 10% tariff is, and what the ultimate end game is going to be. So that's a big open area. But the 10% tariff wasn't put in place. That was implemented. But anyway, going back to the couple months ago when I was trying to answer this question, I predicted tariffs on Canada and Mexico would be just theater. They wouldn't happen. I predicted that they would happen for China. I did think that the administration would move forward on that since they're relatively hawkish on China. So that did come to pass. So here's where I was wrong. China did draw up some retaliatory tariffs. And I was expecting those retaliatory tariffs to encompass pork as well as poultry, because China imports a lot of pork and poultry from the United States, especially from North Carolina. And the retaliatory tariffs they drew up did not actually focus on them. The retaliatory tariffs were actually mostly superficial. They did not really hit back all that hard. They did do some other stuff touching on rare earth minerals that actually did have an impact, but we've talked about those before. Those were pre-existing. And I think that's kind of more where China is kind of focusing its threats right now. And that may actually be working. That's a whole other conversation, though. But yeah, the tariffs went through. The retaliatory tariffs did not impact pork. And so the result then is that pork hasn't really been affected. So I was thinking that the retaliatory tariffs would result in pork prices in the United States being temporarily lower and then eventually increasing over time if the retaliatory tariffs stayed in place. As is, no retaliatory tariffs, so no change in price, at least none that I'm aware of. So at this point, you should be good with your pork tacos. There should not be any significant impact on the price, one way or the other, at least from international trade policy. Actually, I could fact check that. Let's see, what are pork prices right now? No, I want the past month. Up a little bit. Oh, right. I keep forgetting that agriculture is way more complicated than I think it is. Yeah, there's no such thing as pork prices per se. It's individual parts, it's meat, whatever. All right, I'll get back to you on the actual data. I can't look it up on the fly. But in general, there should not be a general impact from the trading relationship. Let's see, since it's very unlikely that there will be any legal consequences for Malay with the Libra crypto scam in Argentina, how likely is it that the president will face consequences in the rest of the world, given that there are people who have been scammed in a plethora of countries? Well, the thing about cryptocurrency is that it's not well regulated. Most countries don't really have don't have laws on the books or have interpreted existing laws to apply to cryptocurrency. So the regulatory space is very unclear, gray, and probably in most parts of the world just absent. So in that sense, I don't think most governments around the world are really even necessarily have the legal framework to go after Malay. I would go further and say that I think a lot of governments kind of see investment in cryptocurrency as being kind of a form of gambling. It's a speculative investment and a high-risk speculative investment at that. So I think a lot of governments around the world, even if they may have the legal framework to go after Malay here, will not do so because they'll see this as a case of basically gamblers getting burned. These are people who purposely and knowingly put their money into a highly volatile commodity so that they could speculate on it and then just lost a bunch of money. And so if that's the framing, then the responsibility is just on those individuals. It's not the responsibility of their home governments to, come out and protect them. So I doubt anything will happen overseas. I don't think other countries or other governments are going to make a big deal out of it. Given most NATO countries are now in compliance with the requirement for 2% of their GDP being spent on defense, what are the causes Canada still is not in compliance with it 10 years after the resolution requiring compliance was passed? Is there voter resistance against increasing defense spending? I'm not sure where Canadian defense spending is. I just really don't hear about them as much as the Europeans, who kind of get blamed more. Yeah, you're right. It is kind of hovering around 1 to 2%. So why? You'd really have to ask somebody more familiar with Canadian politics than me. I don't know like the specific reasons. I know that the Harper government back has it already been 20 years? Like 20 years ago, the Harper government, the last big conservative government in Canada, actually tried to significantly increase defense spending. Partly that was because of the war on terror, but also because they just kind of wanted to. They were more hawkish in terms of foreign policy. The subsequent Trudeau government kind of drew it down. I think, for one, Canada just doesn't face a lot of threats. For much the same reason that Europe has traditionally, since the end of the Cold War, spent much less than 2% of 2% of GDP on defense. There just hasn't really been a compelling threat by which to justify it. You can argue that they let it go too far and that they kind of let their defense institutions hollow out too much, but the underlying justification is that there just wasn't any threat there that really necessitated 2% GDP spending on defense. So Canada, I would guess, is probably in a similar boat. Why do you need to spend 2% of your GDP on defense if you're Canada? Like, the biggest threat, the only country that could conceivably really threaten you is the United States, and they more or less have been very friendly historically. So that's not really a big issue. I think the biggest justification I've heard for Canada to increase defense spending is the thawing of the Arctic Sea, specifically the glaciers, the ice caps, and whatnot. That thawing out makes it more possible for the Northwest Passage to actually open up and for shipping to move through there, and which means that could be a theater in which there is some defense, some military activity by rival states that want to control that route or influence it. So that being the case, it could make some sense for Canada to invest in that and be prepared for it. But it's still kind of early. The Northwest Passage still isn't really open. It's a ways off yet. And so that justification doesn't really hold water. You could argue that they should have more ability to project force, to participate in international missions, or to help the United States and whatever conflict it's involved in. The trouble there is that the United States very frequently gets involved in conflicts of choice that end up blowing up in their face. I should say our face, I guess. And so that doesn't really seem like a compelling reason. Canada doesn't really want to be along for the ride the next time the United States decides to jump into another, unwinnable bush war. So that doesn't really hold water. So I think you're just kind of hard pressed to find like really good reasons for it. I think in general, the commitment to spend 2% of GDP is really just more about maintaining like some capacity, not necessarily even to project force, but just to be ready for contingencies. You don't want to have a military that is just so hollowed out that if there is an unexpected contingency, they just can't do anything. Germany is kind of learning about that the hard way right now. Canada is not as bad as Germany in that regard, but they could spend more. But I think there's just not that pressing political. There's just not enough political demand within Canada to make it happen. And again, I think a big reason for that is just that there's just not a compelling reason to do it. There's not only not a compelling reason to do it, there's a lot of competing political priorities that are just considered more important, or at least if you're a politician, more useful. So again, this is me speaking as somebody who is not sufficiently familiar with Canadian politics to know like the full story of defense politics in Canada over the past 20, 30 years. I know a little bit, but I'm not sufficiently familiar with the details to give you a fully fleshed out answer. So best I can do here is just like a general review and some educated guesses.
We do have a lot of Canadians in the community here, so if you have any local opinions, feel free to share.
I'm sure they're very excited these days.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. I recently heard an analysis trying to explain the culture war agenda coming from the conservative wing in the US. The thesis was that conservative thinkers feel aggrieved for having been sidelined from academia, and other conservatives feel aggrieved for having been sidelined from institutions of culture, film, music, etc. Therefore, the goal is to destroy things the progressive wing loves, even if it harms everyone. What's your take on this analysis? I disagree. The reason I disagree is because I disagree with the framing that academia is Well, I should say I disagree because I disagree with the framing that the fact that conservatives are not all that present in academia is a major factor for the culture war. I don't think, I mean, I've been in a PhD program, so I speak with some experience here. I didn't finish because I suck, but I was there and I did spend a lot of money. So I did learn a few things. And, I did meet a lot of conservative academics. They actually do exist. It's not like they're just some mythical creature or some like tread upon marginalized community, but there's a pretty decent number of them. And furthermore, I would point out that while it is true that a disproportionate share of professors and other academics are of a left-wing political bent, that doesn't mean that like it's a huge crushing majority. It's probably somewhere like 60 to 70% or something like that. So it's not like 90% like some people make it out to be. And furthermore, there tends to be significant variance in the distribution of political affiliation depending on field, which is something that I've never heard culture warriors talk about. They always talk about academia as though it's some big homogenous thing. It's not. Different departments have different cultures, have different distributions of political affiliation. To give you an example, if you're talking about sociology, then like 90% of those professors are going to be like Democrats in the United States case. They're going to be left-wing aligned. But what if you look at something like School of Management, right? And at the UT Dallas, where I went, School of Management teaches, business courses and all that jazz. So their department was actually mostly conservative, like clear cut, mostly conservative. That is to say, most of the professors were conservative. And then if you look at a field like economics, the relevant departments, I think there was a study done, departments tend to be split down the middle in economics. About half of economics professors tend to be conservative, and then the other half are left-wing. So it's not, again, just like a single homogenous hive mind left-wing community in academia. Like it's never been like that.
It's not a cabal?
Huh?
It's not a lefty cabal?
No.
Oh.
And it never has been. Like anybody familiar with discourse in economics, like the actual academic field of economics, would be able to tell you this, because there's whole schools of economics that are just mostly conservative. The Chicago School of Economics is like dominated by conservatives. Like it's a whole equal thing on an equal footing with like any left-wing aligned type school in economics, Keynesianism or neo-Keynesianism or what have you. So I disagree with the framing in that sense. And so I don't think then that you can either say that conservative academics, for example, feel aggrieved, because generally conservative academics dominate their individual departments. They tend to be in the departments in which they are more predominant. And so in that sense, they don't really have much to be aggrieved about. Like if you go to a conference for like business academia, if you go to like a seminar or something, that the business school is hosting, probably most of the professors there will be of a conservative mindset. It's not going to be like some big lib love fest. So I guess the point I want to make there then is that I don't think the framing of the question is such that it indicates that conservative academics themselves are major combatants in the culture war, and that their marginalization in academia is a reason for that. But not only are they not really marginalized in academia in the way that conservative culture warriors tend to frame it, they're not even really combatants in the culture war, because all of the vast majority anyway of the conservative professors that I met and talked to over the course of my truncated, shall we say, academic career, most of them didn't really care about the culture war that much. Most of them were actually pretty, either secular, or if they were religious, they were not really like openly religious. It wasn't like a big part of their identity. Generally, the stuff that they advocated the most for was traditional conservative free market laissez-faire policies, which is pretty much exactly what you would expect in like a school of management or an economics department where I was spending a lot of my time. That was not unusual. But given that that's what they mostly cared about, like I would not expect them to be like the vanguard of the culture war. For the most part, they are not. In fact, in so much as conservative academics have dipped into the culture war, mostly it's been to argue against excesses by the left in terms of things like free speech. There was a period of some years where there was a lot of left-wing activism on campuses that really tried to shut down thinkers that they disagreed with. There would be protests. They would try to get their appearances canceled, etc. There was some momentum to that for a while, and considerable momentum to that for a while. And so conservative academics tended to focus more on that. That's more what they didn't like, and that's what they were the most vocal about. But other things, sort of the the lumpen culture war, if you want to call it that, that stuff doesn't appeal to them, and they tend to stay out of that. So they're not even really a part of the culture war in that sense. And so I do not agree with the framing then that has them centered as main players in the culture war. So I guess in that sense, that would be my response then. I'm not agreeing with the framing, then I can't really answer the rest of it because I don't think it has a solid foundation. Let's see. Can you talk about South American gangs? Some? Are there any safe South American countries to travel to right now? Is Argentina safe with Javier Milei in power? Dagnip might have something to say about that. I can't talk a whole lot about South American gangs, but there's definitely some big ones. The one that's most famous now in the United States is Tren de Aragua. I apologize, I cannot pronounce it. My tongue can't handle it. I took French in high school instead of Spanish, and people have made me regret it ever since. I don't regret it, but it definitely would have been useful. So Tren de Aragua, however that's pronounced, that's a big Venezuelan gang, and it's made the rounds in U.S. political discourse because it's kind of been held up as emblematic of unchecked immigration into the United States. This gang previously didn't have a presence here, and because of America's open border policies, now they're everywhere. That's sort of the argumentation. So without getting into that side of it anyway, I am somewhat familiar with them. I know there's a big gang in Brazil called the Army of something. I think they're centered in Rio. What am I thinking of? Brazil gang, Army of Commando Vermelho. All right, I'm not getting the name I was looking for, so I guess I don't. I could have sworn there was a major one that was named Army of something, but it didn't come up. Brazil has a number of large gangs, and they've gotten more active over the past 20 years. Drug trafficking, human trafficking is the usual, large gang behavior. Nothing unusual there. I think those are the only two I could really think of off the top of my head, though. I know that there's a decent number of Arab gangs in the tri-border area, along the tri-border of Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay. There's actually a pretty large number of Lebanese Arabs that migrated to South America over the past 100 years. And there was actually some concern after 9/11 in the early war on terror that Hezbollah and other terrorist actors might actually use the Arab migrant population in the tri-border area to basically raise funds, to engage in illicit activity that would generate funds for overseas terrorist activities. And the Bush administration was concerned enough about that they actually negotiated an air base, I should say access to an air base in Paraguay. I believe it was in Paraguay anyway. And that was supposed to be the sort of jumping off point for the projection of American power in that particular region to try to kind of snuff out that potential threat. I don't think anything ever really came of it. And, it kind of just disappeared after that as an issue. Hezbollah is still active there, and there's been rumors about them kind of being involved in terrorist attacks in Argentina. There was like one big one targeting a Jewish center in Buenos Aires back in the 90s, I think, that was supposedly linked to Hezbollah. That's a big thing to argue about down there. People still argue about that. Some people say it's conspiracy theory, some people not. But without getting into the details of that, that's kind of indicative of that was the result, rather, of that large Arab population in that region. So I don't know if they have large gangs of their own there, but I do know that is kind of a major trafficking area. Let's see. I think there's been some big ones in Ecuador recently, but I think those were all just drug trafficking gangs, kind of linked to Mexican cartels. Some gangs just specialize in drug trafficking, and that's their thing, and they'll just kind of move around to whichever country they think gives them the best prospects of getting their drugs through. So for a long time, that was Colombia, then it was Mexico. Shifted for a while to Ecuador recently. I think we talked a bit about that when it happened. It just kind of moves around depending on where the opportunities are. Are there any safe South American countries to travel to right now? Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, it's not as though South America is just nothing but violent gangs. You can go there, like it'll be okay for the most part. Just listen to the travel advisory for your, embassy, whatever country you're from. Pick a relatively safe tourist destination and just kind of have fun. There are places you should not go, but those places do not encompass like the entirety of the continent. You can go to Brazil, you can go to Argentina. Argentina might even be a good choice right now because everything is going to be very cheap. The economy is not doing well. I'm sure the locals would appreciate the currency in any case. Brazil has its problems, but it's definitely got its big tourist attractions. People still go there. That people still go to. Colombia, it's good. It's been getting better. There's actually been a big increase in tourism to Colombia over the past 10, 20 years. But they've also got problems. There is still violence in parts of the country. There is still crime. And there has been a relative uptick in violence with regard to rebels over the past couple of years. That kind of has to do with, I forget their name. Not FARC, but the other one, the LA. I forget what the name is in English, but in Spanish it's the ELA. There's been some violence there, and there's been violence sort of in the rural areas, if I'm not mistaken. But other than that, if you're willing to take some risk, it should be okay, hypothetically. I would point out, though, that some of the big uptick in tourism to Colombia has actually been sex tourism. So that may or may not be what you're interested in. If not, then maybe there are other locations. Ecuador is probably not the best choice right now. I think it's calmed down a bit in Ecuador over the past year.
They use US dollars, right?
They do, correct.
Yeah. Makes it easy.
Yeah. Peru has been out of the headlines for more than a year for me. I've not seen a lot of updates on what's going on in Peru. It's been an absolute shit show for like 5 to 10 years now. Not horrible. It's not like a failed state, but Peruvian politics has been weirdly dramatic, even by their standards, over the past 5 to 10 years. I would assume that if they haven't been in the headlines for a while, that means things have settled down a little bit. But given how much tension there was the last time I checked in on them, I'm a little dubious they're fully over it. We'll see. I don't know that Peru is even really known for tourism, though, so I don't know that that really qualifies here. I don't think Paraguay has ever been known for tourism. I don't know, maybe there's some like hidden gems there that I'm just not aware of, but I've never associated Paraguay with large-scale tourism, so I don't know one way or the other whether or not that's worth doing. Uruguay could be a very good choice. Uruguay is well known for being very safe, having very stable politics, no violence. Sort of the Switzerland of South America is how I've heard them described. So if you want to go, Uruguay could be a good choice. I'm not sufficiently familiar with tourism in Uruguay to know what there is to see, but I'm sure they've got something. Every country does pretty much. What else is there? Bolivia? They've definitely got like some awesome natural stuff there, the Amazon rainforest and whatnot, but the politics is a little wild. Not like Civil War wild, but it's unstable. I don't know entirely what the crime situation is at a local level, such that I would be comfortable fully recommending it. I'll defer to chat on that. How safe is Bolivia to go to as a tourist? If nothing else, you can always go to French Guinea. I don't know that they have like full-on developed world levels of security there, but it is technically a part of France. So if you're really concerned about safety, that might be a decent way to go. Assuming you just have to go to somewhere in South America anyway. Guyana and Suriname are options, but they're very poor. And I'm pretty sure the president of one of them is a former murderer, if I'm not mistaken. I think we talked about that some years ago when he was elected, but I never heard a follow-up. If I ever don't answer these questions to the satisfaction of the questioner, feel free to ask again. Sometimes I miss the gist of a question or something, so I'm happy to kind of return to it if necessary. Let's see. Have you discussed birthright citizenship? If not, could you speak on it? We talked about it last time. Yeah, I suspect that the courts will end up overturning the relevant executive order. I would assume so. And I would point out that the executive order in question did not fully try to overturn birthright citizenship. It was more just sort of a bureaucratic hindering, if you like, of birthright citizenship. So technically, even with the executive order in place, you're still an American citizen if you're born here, regardless of the legality, of your parents. What the executive order does is it just orders federal agencies not to share documents with you. So, for example, your birth certificate, social security card, etc. Technically, if your parents are illegal immigrants, then the government, according to this order, is not allowed to share or provide those documents with you. Which is a problem, but it also does not mean that you're not a citizen. You should still be able to get those documents eventually. You should still be able to get proof that you were born here, even if the government doesn't offer them up like immediately, like they're still technically on file. Basically, I just think it was a superficial attempt to pander to the base. He promised to do a thing and then he pretended to do it, even though he knows it's not going to stick in the courts. The theme with the Trump administration, both this one and the previous one, was always theater. His voters voted him in to do big dramatic things, and then he feels obligated to do them, and he does. They're just not effectual. They don't do anything. It has no significant real world impact 90% of the time. So that's where birthright citizenship is at right now. He did a big flashy thing. It's in the courts. The courts almost certainly are going to shoot it down. If they don't, then we're in uncharted territory, and we'll definitely be talking about this more. But the expectation amongst almost everybody, including people in the Trump administration, I suspect, is that the courts will stop it. Given how many people are taking everything said by the Trump administration seriously, even when it's obviously posturing, have you created a bingo card of what future statements may be? If so, can you share the bingo card? I do not have a bingo card yet. I mean, the trouble is that the administration is very unpredictable in its posturing. Like, there are core issues that it promised to take action on that you can kind of bank on them posturing on, but you never really know how they're going to operationalize it. Like, the idea of reciprocal tariffs is not something they've mentioned before. That was news to me. It kind of makes sense given how he's harped on, having equal relations and whatnot. In America's trading relationships, but the idea that he would systematically go through fucking 10 million lines of tariffs in every country on the planet's tariff schedule to systematically root out all of the differences with the U.S. tariff schedule, that seems crazy. That doesn't seem real. I could not have predicted that. I would not be able, if I had tried to construct a bingo card, that would not have been on it. That's just so far out and so fringe. Yeah, with the Trump administration, there are some things you can try to predict, but for the most part, you're just kind of along for the ride. And that's on purpose. The Trump administration's governance philosophy is that you don't need to consult the public. You don't need the public to be in on the deliberations that happen within the administration vis-a-vis policy. You can kind of just dictate terms to the public. You can tell them what you think they need to hear to support you. And if they don't support you, then you can just ignore them. Beyond that, public policy is your business as the government and nobody else's. And you can just freely exclude everybody not involved. And if they don't like it, then fuck them. That seems to be how the Trump administration follows, how they govern, that their governing philosophy. And they've not really deviated from that very much. It's actually kind of similar to the Bush administration, that is to say, the George W. Bush administration. Obviously, there's a lot of policy differences on a number of issues there, but in terms of governance, in terms of how bellicose and domineering they are, in terms of how they communicate with the public, they're very similar. So that's it for questions.
Nice, well done.
So, next up, Trump foreign policy news. Are we doing okay on time?
Yeah, we're at 1 hour 50.
Okay. Okay, where are we? So we were doing tariffs, now we're doing... All right, let me find it. Had to put bookmarks in the notepad file because it's so big. No, not that. All right. So this is just going to be a general review of Trump foreign policy vis-a-vis different regions. I've got them kind of organized by region. And so, there'll be highlights. We'll get to Ukraine and whatnot. That's definitely going to be a big one. But some of them are just going to be like little notes, and I'll just kind of breeze through them. So let's see, to start with, if I can find it. No, that's tariffs again. I'm very slowly working my way through. Here we go.
You got this.
Okay, so an early announcement by the Trump administration, they announced that they wanted to join an international anti-abortion pact. This is something that's been signed by countries like Saudi Arabia and a variety of other countries that are very much opposed to abortion. There's kind of always been talk in conservative circles about joining it, but I don't think anybody in a government has really seriously talked about it until now. So that could be in the news in the future if they actually follow through with that. I don't know if Congress would necessarily approve that. I imagine there will be a big fight about that, but we'll see. So potential grounds for future fireworks there. But otherwise, that's a pretty minor thing. I don't think joining a pact like that would necessarily obligate the United States to do anything it couldn't already legally do on its own. But for those of you who are really invested in the abortion issue one way or the other, that'll definitely be one of your highlights if it happens. It'll be in your news feed. So Ukraine. Lots of Ukraine developments. So many. I didn't even finish adding all of my notes to this section. I was still doing it when we started. You could probably hear me on the keyboard. So I'll try to get you as up to date as I can and to try to kind of elaborate on what's happening as I go. But otherwise, this is not like a fully complete list because there's just so much drama happening right now. So early on in the new Trump administration, Trump came out and pressured Putin to end the war in Ukraine. And that pressure included threatening sanctions and tariffs, or more accurately, more sanctions anyway. So that was a little bit discouraging for Moscow because they had been hoping that the Trump administration, having voiced its criticism and skepticism of the conflict in Ukraine and of the Ukrainian government in particular, that they might be more friendly to Moscow. And so early on, then, the early signal was that that would not be the case. And it looked like the Trump administration would actually end up largely maintaining the pre-existing American policy on Ukraine, which is to support them with, aid and whatnot for however long was necessary in order to kind of get the Russians to come to the table and negotiate on a more favorable footing for Ukraine. So basically just status quo, but with more flair, if you like. There was also a peace plan that was quote-unquote leaked. It suggested a peace agreement that might be more favorable to Russia, but then it came out that the Ukrainian news outlet that released that has a history of being pro-Russian. So a lot of people just kind of wrote that off as misinformation. The outlet was called Strana, by the way. Then the tide kind of changed a little bit, and by a little bit I mean a lot. So Trump's envoy to Ukraine said that elections in Ukraine should follow a ceasefire. And that may not sound like a dramatic pronouncement, but it is a little bit uncouth for a foreigner, even one in, a foreign government, to kind of dictate or demand, rather, when and where another country should hold elections. So that kind of set up a red flag. That was unusual in and of itself. It was also unusual because there is a line of Russian misinformation that accuses Zelensky of being a dictator because Ukraine has not had elections as scheduled. Now, the reason elections were delayed was because the country is under martial law, and constitutionally speaking, Ukraine cannot hold an election while under martial law. For those of you wondering why that rule exists, it exists because it would be easy for a would-be dictator to avoid elections by arbitrarily announcing martial law. So in order to discourage a potential authoritarian president from doing that, they have it in the Constitution that they can't have an election at the same time that there's martial law. So that's actually meant to defend democracy, not undermine it. But of course, if somebody invades you, then you don't have a lot of choice. That's why martial law exists right now, and that being the case, they can't then hold elections, just legally speaking. There's also the fact that there's a lot of Russian misinformation and that a lot of people are living in occupied territory, and people, oh, by the way, are also being bombed intermittently by Russian actual bombs anyway, glide bombs, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, what have you. And also, if they did hold elections, it's almost guaranteed that the Russians would attack the polling places and kill a bunch of people, which of course is probably going to impact turnout and the outcome of the election. So elections are not really feasible at the moment. These are not really ideal circumstances, legally or otherwise. But the Russian government, as well as its, fellow travelers, if you want to call them that, in other countries have kind of continued this line that Zelensky has delayed elections because he wants to hold on to power, that he's undermined the opposition unfairly, and that he's otherwise just a dictator in everything but name, and that the West is being fooled by this man and is helping keep him in power by just giving him a bunch of resources that he is actually secretly stealing and keeping and selling and keeping the money for himself for his own purposes. So this Trump envoy saying that elections should follow a ceasefire, again, the statement in and of itself isn't that bad, but it's adjacent to Russian misinformation, which had pro-Ukrainian people, certainly Ukrainians, a little fidgety. They weren't entirely sure what to make of that. They were a little anxious, especially given some of the anti-Ukraine things Trump himself and some of the other people in his new administration have said in the past. So that was one of the first indications that maybe things were not going to be as pro-Ukrainian as thought, as the earliest statements against Russia had suggested. Some other remarks made at the same time. There were remarks by the new administration suggesting Trump may ease up on tariffs if Beijing plays ball on Ukraine, suggesting that the United States may angle to try to bring Chinese pressure to bear on the conflict, try to bring it to end. Trump also suggested that if Ukraine guarantees a supply of rare earths metals, then there would be $300 billion in quote-unquote support that would be made available to it. This rare earths metals thing sounds weird, but it's going to come up again later, believe me. This has been in the news the past couple days even. So the China thing hasn't gone anywhere. I haven't heard anything about that since that comment was made. I doubt anything will happen with regard to it either. I don't think Beijing is really that interested in the conflict in general. For example, I don't think China is supporting Russia as much as some China hawks are saying they are. They're definitely providing some support, but they could be providing a lot more support if they really wanted to fully invest in the conflict's outcome. And as is, they're just kind of blasé about it. On the one hand, they don't really want the West to win. They would rather kind of undermine them and try to undermine the international order that the West kind of props up, so that they could expand their own influence within that order. But at the same time, it's kind of risky to be fully confrontational with the West, and China actually would prefer to cultivate good relations with European countries, which they had been doing before Russia started a huge-ass war in the region, which obviously, being a Russian ally, kind of undermined China's relations with a lot of the states that they had been making inroads with as part of their Belt and Road Initiative, as well as other trading initiatives. So yes, China does support Russia, does provide them aid in the conflict, but Russia's war kind of actually fucked up their foreign policy in Europe more than a little bit. And given that Russia started the war without really asking them, they're not really fully committed to its outcome in that sense. They would actually probably much prefer that it end, honestly. But that said, I don't think they're so committed to ending it that they would want to compromise their relationship with Russia, which they still see as their main ally in Europe, if not their big ally internationally. So Trump's excuse me. So I think Trump's idea here of trying to get Beijing in on the peace talks, that's not a bad idea. But my criticism is that there's pretty much no way China is going to do that. They would much rather just maintain relations with Russia without overly investing in a conflict that's going to completely undermine relations with all the countries and all the other countries in Europe that are skeptical of the war. So China, in my opinion, is going to sit things out, regardless of any outreach by Washington. So that hasn't gone anywhere. No updates on that. The rare earths minerals thing, that definitely has come up again, but we'll get to that. We'll save that for later. It was a weird comment to make at the time. A lot of people did criticize it. They said that, American foreign policy should not be reduced to just corrupt quid pros quo. It should be just based more on principle and or national interest, which that deal did not seem to be. But we'll get to that. Let's see, rare earths. Oh, I guess we'll get to it now. This is the next note. I'm just going through my notes here. Again, I haven't had time to organize just all of the pages of stuff that I have. Let's see. So $300 billion in military assistance. So Zelensky kind of supported this. Less than 20% of Ukraine's mineral resources, including about half, were basically under Russian occupation. So the idea was that if America kind of agreed to do this, then in order to actually get access to the minerals, then America would nominally be committed to getting Ukraine, that is to say, helping Ukraine reconquer these lost territories where the minerals were actually located. So from a Ukrainian perspective, that kind of made sense. I think it also made sense for another more important reason, which is that it's almost certainly all just kayfabe. It's almost just certainly more theater. I think the mineral agreement is just a front for the Trump administration to justify further aid to Ukraine. They've been kind of pushing hard on the line, even during the presidential election, that Ukraine is just kind of conning the American public, that it's a big drain on resources, et cetera. So if they are going to continue aid to Ukraine, which I think is what they kind of secretly want to do, they need an excuse to do it to mollify supporters. And I think the mineral deal is what that's going to be. So if the mineral deal is just superficial bullshit, then it doesn't have to be a substantive deal that actually signs over any minerals. And if that's what's on offer, if the Trump administration is actually putting forward a deal that doesn't actually require Zelensky and Ukraine to give them anything in exchange for actual tangible military aid, that's a clear-cut yes for Ukraine. Of course, the Ukrainian government is going to say yes to that. So I think that's the real impetus here for early Ukrainian enthusiasm. There was also talk about liquid natural gas. Zelensky made some noise about storing American natural gas for consumption in Europe, but I'm not really sure what the gist of that was. You can store liquid natural gas virtually anywhere. It doesn't need to be in one particular place. I think it would make more sense if Ukraine offered to buy a bunch of liquid natural gas. I think that would be more appealing for Washington, but I think everybody knows Ukraine just doesn't have a large enough market to really buy a lot of LNG from the United States. So that promise wouldn't be credible. Offering to store it, that's more credible, but I don't really know, again, what the necessity of that would be. It seems like it would be very redundant. So I think that was just Zelensky trying to kind of spitball and trying to add his own shine to, again, what I think is a superficial bullshit agreement. So in that sense, I think they were pretty smart here as far as trying to indulge the administration in the kayfabe that they were engaging in, if that is indeed what it was. Then things took another turn. So the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, gave some statements in an interview saying that there would be no NATO membership for Ukraine, that he wanted Europe to take on a lion's share of support for Ukraine. He also ruled out U.S. peacekeepers and or any military deployments in general to Ukraine as part of any peace deal. And he also said that there was no realistic possibility of returning to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders. All of these things are objectively stupid things for him as Secretary of Defense to say. And I still can't believe that he actually did it. From the perspective of domestic political consumption, it does make sense. It makes sense because these are things that a lot of people who voted for Trump themselves believe. Not all of them, but a good chunk of them. And Pete Hegseth, for those of you who don't know, does not have a significant background in the military. He was never an officer, for example. His main career consisted of being a talking head on Fox News. He was a pundit. And if you're a political pundit, then this is the kind of stuff you've been talking about for a long time. So it probably didn't even really occur to him that it would be a big deal. He probably thought he was just regurgitating shit that he'd already said before when he was on cable TV. But in his capacity as Secretary of Defense, those words mean something different. He is, in saying those things, explicitly outlining the U.S. position in a negotiation. And there was a big dogpile of people on him, even Republicans, who were criticizing him for doing this. There was a senator from Mississippi who said it was a just rookie mistake. That was the quote, I believe. If you're going to enter into a big high-stakes negotiation with another country, you don't outline your position ahead of time. That should be ambiguous. You're supposed to go in and have that be ambiguous and then negotiate using that ambiguity as favorable a position as possible. Since the other guy, if he doesn't know your position, he may assume things that aren't true and give you more than you would get otherwise. So this was a mistake. This was just a dumb move on his part. It might indicate some of the thinking within the administration, which is the main reason I bring it up here. If these things are indicative of what the administration has in mind, some of it is reasonable. I think maybe hardcore Ukrainian backers thought maybe Ukraine could get its pre-2014 borders. I think most people are kind of more realistic about that. Crimea is probably a lost cause at this point. Even big Ukraine supporters in the US government have kind of voiced that opinion. So that's not unreasonable. Saying you want Europe to take on a lion's share of support for Ukraine, that's fairly reasonable. That's consistent with previous US government statements across administrations about wanting Europe to be more proactive in its own defense. Ruling out US peacekeepers and saying especially that Ukraine will never join NATO, those are the most damaging things to admit ahead of a negotiation. Because Ukraine very much wants NATO membership, Russia very much does not want it. You should go into the negotiation leaving that ambiguous so that you can say, hey, maybe we'll agree that Ukraine will not be in NATO. In exchange for doing that, though, we want something. But if you go into the negotiation with the Russians knowing that you yourself don't want that, then they don't have to give any concessions to get that. They know you're going to do that anyway. So you lose a concession by conceding that before the negotiation starts. Now, again, this could just be the Secretary of Defense mouthing off. And given that he's a former political pundit, I actually think that's relatively more likely. But if these are substantive representations of what the administration is going for, they kind of shot themselves in the foot here. Well, not kind of, they really shot themselves in the foot here. This is not the kind of mistake you want to be making here ahead of a big peace talks for a war that you claim to be very invested in ending. Now, I want to point out too here that Pete Hegseth, Secretary of Defense, he walked these statements back a day later, and he clarified, quote, that this is a quote from the article. He clarified that all options were in fact still on the table for Trump to use as leverage. End quote. So that's a nice sentiment, but the horse has already left the barn. It's closing the barn doors after the horse has already left. You kind of already made the error there, and that's not really the best walking back I've seen. He probably should have said more something like, "These are my opinions" or something like that. But missed opportunity. Anyway, he walked back the statements. He himself recognized the error, and hopefully that won't happen again. I think there were better candidates for Secretary of Defense that would have kind of known not to do that, but we are where we are. I think we've talked before about the nature of authoritarian appointments and how they prioritize loyalty over competence and professionalism, and how that manifests in terms of lower quality performance in the bureaucracy. So some early examples of that. Okay, the next thing, Trump had a phone call with Putin and said peace negotiations will begin immediately. This was a big surprise because, perhaps unsurprisingly, he did not consult with fucking anybody. ahead of that. At least nobody in a partner country. So Europe was completely blindsided. They were not expecting that. And Ukraine also was not consulted. They didn't know that was going to happen either. So Europe was very, very upset about that. And when I say upset, I don't necessarily mean angry. I mean just anxious, because they didn't know whether or not the Trump administration was going to completely cut them out of the peace negotiations and then try to impose some kind of negotiated settlement on them that did not have any of their input. Now, as is tradition with this Trump administration and the previous Trump administration, there are conflicting voices within the administration. Some people had come out and kind of supported this idea that the United States should unilaterally, negotiate with Russia, and that Europe wasn't that important. But then there are other players, and specifically the Secretary of State in this case, Marco Rubio, have come out and said that no, we're not going to cut Europe out completely. We are going to unilaterally start negotiations, but we are going to take your input into consideration. So who's right? Who's to say? It's kind of unclear, again, where the balance of power is in the administration as far as how to deal with Ukraine and Russia. We're going to find out eventually over the next couple months, probably. But for now, there's just a lot of mixed, confusing signals. Regardless, though, unilaterally starting negotiations without consulting allies, or at least giving them some notification, that was the main reason why there was so much news coming, I should say, so much noise coming out of Europe after that announcement. When they were talking about how America was abandoning Europe, potentially abandoning NATO, how Europe was on its own, that stemmed from this announcement. And I don't know how much of that you followed, Neuro, but it's been a big thing in Europe. There is genuine consternation and concern that Europe may well actually end up is in the process of being abandoned, and they may have to significantly build up their own defense capability in order to replace what could soon be a missing American security umbrella. So that was some big drama. The peace negotiations did indeed begin shortly thereafter, and we'll kind of get to that. But before peace negotiations formally started, but after the announcement, there was a big security conference in Munich, Germany. And there was more drama that came out of this in a similar vein. For whatever reason, the United States sent as its main representative to the conference its vice president, J.D. Vance, which is unusual because vice presidents normally just don't matter. They're basically powerless figures within American politics. Basically, your only real significance is that you're a kind of bench warmer for the presidency. If you're vice president, there's a better than decent chance you'll end up running for president yourself after the current president serves his second term. So it kind of gives you a big advantage if that is something that you want to eventually do. But other than that, while you're actually vice president, you have virtually no power. There's really just fuck all you can really do. It's not the kind of person you would send to a major international forum. These are not generally the guys you use to voice policy. But for some reason, Vance was the guy at the Munich Security Summit. And he gave a big speech. And he said some weird shit. I've even read that originally his own speech was supposed to focus mostly on security issues, but that he changed it like a day or two before the conference. This isn't even something that Vance himself had been necessarily planning on doing. Let's see. So what did he do? He hectored Europe in the speech for, quote unquote, failing to stand up for its values. In particular, he noted so-called free speech violations, for example, like the UK banning protests within 150 meters of abortion clinics. He also accused them of ignoring voter concerns about migration. He said that the US could use, quote unquote, military tools of leverage to compel Russia to do a deal. And then he also followed up by meeting with leaders of the AfD in Germany. So all of this is very strange. For one, it's unusual for representatives of a state to directly criticize an allied country for domestic political events. Whether or not you regulate protests around abortion clinics and this, that, or the other way, that's not really anybody's business but the people in that country. And the United States has on occasion criticized other countries for well, obviously human rights abuses and whatnot, but generally for small ball stuff like this, it's not our business. We stay out of it, and it's considered a diplomatic faux pas to intercede like that. But JD Vance doesn't give a fuck about diplomatic faux pas. He just kind of jumped right into that. I'm not sure why. Obviously, JD Vance kind of hews more towards the, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, the alt-right, let's say. He has kind of a political background with that group. So it does make some sense for him to kind of cater to that crowd. But he's not running for office in Europe. You know, he's the vice president of the United States. So what's the point? Like, is he trying to boost like-minded political actors in Europe? That's possible, but it would also be fairly unprecedented. That's not something the United States has historically done in allied states. CIA interventions in Italy and whatnot notwithstanding. Like, other than like secret interventions, let's say, the United States generally doesn't directly, overtly intervene in friendly states politics like this. It's very unusual, especially since the Cold War ended, when even the secret stuff kind of largely ebbed. Saying that the US could use military tools of leverage to compel Russia to a deal, that was in keeping with the Trump administration's early pronouncements that it wanted to pressure Russia to negotiate. So that's not necessarily inconsistent, but saying that the United States would use its own military to try to leverage Russia, that was new. Pretty much anybody and everybody has agreed that the United States was highly unlikely to directly intervene in the conflict, and that doing so would be very unpopular in the United States. So suggesting that that might not be the case and that the United States may actually end up doing that was new. And I don't think entirely credible. I don't think the administration is actually considering that. So I think that was more just Vance talking shit. Meeting with AfD leaders, again, it's kind of a diplomatic faux pas to do that. You're not supposed to meet with major political parties, especially during an election, right? It has been done. You know, you can meet with major leaders of political parties to discuss foreign policy stuff or a big trade deal, something like that. That's not unusual. But just jumping in to weigh in on an election so that you can influence the outcome, that's relatively new. I would point out that that's not something that the rest of the administration is doing. So this is not the case of like the whole last Trump administration deciding that it's in America's best interest that the AfD win Germany's election. I think this is something JD Vance just wanted to do. I think he did that on his own initiative. I would point out, too, that technically the guy in the U.S. government who's responsible for American foreign policy is the Secretary of State, the head of the State Department. And that's Marco Rubio, and he has not verified or followed up with any of this shit. Whenever he's talked about American foreign policy, it has actually been fairly consistent with traditional American foreign policy objectives and policies. I haven't seen any of this Vance-style weirdness in his statements. So I don't know if that's indicative that maybe the administration secretly is kind of agreeing with Vance and wants to voice that, and maybe Rubio just feels he has to be more formal, or if there's just no cooperation between different parts of the administration, and Vance just did something on his own without telling anybody, and that Rubio is going to have like his own position that may or may not end up being the official position of the government, depending on, you know, who's more influential within the administration. I'm inclined to think it's the latter, since that's pretty much how it worked in the first Trump administration. I would hope that the second Trump administration would be a little more organized, but the early going suggests that's not going to be the case, but we'll see. So other dumb things that happened at the Munich Security Council, there's more. There was a questionnaire that was distributed to the representatives of European countries by the American envoy. And there were 6 questions, with one specifically for European Union member states. Quote, the Americans are approaching European capitals and asking how many soldiers they are ready to deploy, one diplomat. In keeping with Secretary of Defense statements that the U.S. would not allow troops to Ukraine as part of a peace agreement. Yeah. So basically, they were just kind of pressuring states here to increase European defense spending. They issued this questionnaire as a kind of form of intimidation to kind of imply that, strongly imply, if not outright signal, that the United States would not be participating, would not allow its military to participate in some kind of peacekeeping mission in Ukraine as a part of any peace deal. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. You know, if the United States government does not, as a matter of policy, want to deploy into Ukraine, it makes sense then, if you are interested in, you know, potentially having that as be a part of the agreement, to push European states to fill that role. And given that it is Europe, it makes sense for European states to take on a disproportionate role. I would agree with that much. That's probably one of the less weird things that happened. The weirdness, my critique, if you like, is why they had to do that in the form of a questionnaire. I feel like you could just do that through normal channels. So it seems like the Trump administration is nothing if not creative with some of its signaling. There was a personal meeting between J.D. Vance and Zelensky. I don't think anything much came of that. However, the Secretary of Treasury, Besant, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, also met with Zelensky, and he sprung a surprise document on him. And this actually goes back to the mineral agreement that we talked to earlier. So he actually had an agreement in hand that he asked Zelensky to sign, which supposedly would have handed over a big chunk of Ukraine's mineral wealth to the United States. I have no idea what the details of that agreement is. I don't even know what is meant by turn over half of Ukraine's mineral wealth, because mineral wealth encompasses a wide variety of minerals. Early on, Trump had been talking. Sorry?
Give us your salt.
Salt, yeah, it could be. Early on, Trump had mentioned specifically rare earth minerals, but it's not clear if those were specifically the minerals mentioned in the agreement. I don't even necessarily know how you would do that. There's no such thing as a deposit of rare earth minerals. Rare earths are everywhere. They can be relatively more concentrated in some areas than others, but the concentration is always very, very low. You don't have deposits of rare earths like you would, say, lithium or something like that. So there's a difference between rare earths, which are just everywhere but unconcentrated, and critical minerals, which is what have come to be called critical minerals, like lithium, where you actually can find large deposits of them, of a very high concentration and purity. So Trump started out talking about rare earths. Somebody in the admin probably said that's not really a thing we can do, just like physically speaking. And so then it evolved into critical minerals, and perhaps at some point it's now just devolved or evolved, depending on how you want to frame it, into general mineral rights for minerals of any and all kinds. Again, it's just not clear because they haven't released the details of this, and the whole thing could still be kayfabe. The whole agreement could just be more bullshit. Regardless, though, Zelensky did not sign the agreement because it included no U.S. commitments. I could see that happening regardless of whether or not the agreement was kayfabe or not, because I think Zelensky sees the mineral agreement as some point of leverage, however slight, even if it's superficial. And I don't think he wants to give away anything, even if it's fake, without something in return. And that something in return has to be something that substantively contributes to the war effort and to the security of Ukraine. That did not go over entirely well. The Trump administration had really wanted him to sign that agreement. It was relatively contained. Nobody was really screaming about it, but I think the impression I got from comments from the administration officials is that they had assumed that they had agreement in practice and that the agreement would be signed during that meeting, and were a little taken aback when it turned out that didn't happen. We'll get to a little more about that later. So the U.S. envoy to this security meeting, one of them anyway, Kellogg, he made some comments at Munich of his own, stating that Europe and Ukraine would not be part of negotiations. I kind of mentioned this earlier when I mentioned the peace negotiations being suddenly announced. So Kellogg was one of the guys that said, we're going to cut them out. This is going to be a bilateral Russo-American negotiation. And then the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, came out and just directly contradicted him. His statement specifically said that Europe and Ukraine will be part of the negotiations. So again, just the administration doesn't seem to be coordinating sufficiently within itself here. So as part of these developments, the sudden announcement of the peace negotiations, the implication that Europe would not be part of the negotiations, as well as J.D. Vance's weirdness at the Munich Security Council, that resulted in an emergency meeting being announced, I should say, that was agreed to by different major leading European states in the aftermath of the Munich Security Conference, in which they would get together and try to discuss a common approach to dealing with the problem of Ukraine, and the war therein, but also the Trump administration and its mercurial approach to peace in Ukraine, shall we say. And one of the things that happened therein is that I believe it was the French government, which is actually pretty consistent with their past behavior in this regard, declaring that there needed to be the construction of a European army. The French thinking has long been that Europe needs to be more independent of the US on security matters. That's not necessarily controversial. More controversial is that they think they should be the ones to lead that effort, if not the ones to control the European army in question that might be created. Other developments out of that meeting. I should add that the Ukrainian government also supported the call for the creation of a European army. Just throwing that in there. No surprise. Also at that meeting, the Prime Minister of the UK floated the idea of European peacekeeper troops in Ukraine as part of a potential peace deal, consistent with what the Trump administration was kind of pushing them to do. And he actually offered to send British peacekeepers into Ukraine as part of that agreement, if it happens. The UK was easily the most gung-ho about that. The Polish government was actually not interested, which I found a little unusual. Generally, they've been one of the more gung-ho governments about supporting Ukraine, but they're a little gun-shy, it seems, about directly deploying into Ukraine. Let's see, the Prime Minister of the UK also asserted that even if the UK is willing to send peacekeeper troops, he's still of the mind that any peace agreement will still require some kind of quote-unquote US backstop in order for it to have credibility and to actually deter Russian aggression. So he's conceding ground here to the Trump administration that Europe should deploy peacekeepers to Ukraine, but he's adding the caveat that the perspective of the Europeans is that even if they deploy peacekeepers, it may not be enough to deter aggression unless Russia knows that America will not also come to help Ukraine if it's attacked, even if American troops are not actually in Ukraine. As peacekeepers, I mean, actually in Ukraine as peacekeepers. Okay, so there's been some mild pushback from the Trump administration's pronouncements on this because of all the drama with Europe feeling like the US might be abandoning it and Russia feeling a little bit emboldened. There's been some pushback from some of the more traditional conservatives in the Senate, in the Republican Senate. Among Republican senators in the U.S. There was a Mississippi senator who's, this is the rookie mistake comment. He was very critical of that. Lindsey Graham said that the U.S. should tell Putin that if Ukraine is ever attacked again, then Ukraine would be immediately admitted into NATO. I thought that was kind of a stupid thing to say, but
you're immediately in, just right away.
Yeah, just you're immediately a member of NATO and you're protected, which I would point out is basically the same thing as just being in NATO. You might as well just let them in at that point. I'm not sure what the gist of that is. The Russians don't want them in NATO, so maybe that's supposed to be some kind of concession, but I don't think Moscow is going to see that as an actual concession. So Lindsey Graham just kind of throwing shit at the wall to see what sticks. But I think, regardless, the fact that he would say that indicates that he does still want to support Ukraine. And he isn't necessarily comfortable with the idea that the United States would just outright say that, we're not going to let them in ever under any circumstances. So, peace negotiations. Saudi Arabia offered to host them. Both Russia and the United States agreed. So the talks, which are ongoing, are happening in somewhere in Saudi Arabia. I think Riyadh. I'm not sure off the top of my head. Not much has been agreed thus far, at least nothing that's been released to the public. We'll see. There were a couple of points that were agreed early on. One is that the U.S. and Russia should work towards normalizing relations, and also that they should reestablish ambassadors in each other's territory. They both still have embassies in each other's territory, but they symbolically withdrew each other as ambassadors over the conflict in Ukraine. So reestablishing ambassadors, that's not a big deal. Agreeing to work towards normalizing relations, that's also not a big deal. That could mean anything, and it could play out over any time frame. Working towards normalizing relations does not imply a fast pace of normalizing relations. It could be, in fact, exceedingly slow. So, these are basically just nice, superficial, feel-good things to concede to each other to kind of establish some good faith early on, but they don't really mean anything beyond that. So the next big thing was the minerals agreement. Like I mentioned, it was going to come up again, so here it is. The Trump administration has exhibited a little more candor in the past couple days about what was kind of meant by the mineral agreement. So the framing for this, and I'll quote from the article I got this note from, Trump has styled this as a way for Ukraine to repay the U.S. for its past military support, end quote. So initially, it was supposed to be a quid pro quo, as you might recall. The initial statement that Trump made when he first brought up the idea of a mineral agreement was just that Ukraine would give mineral rights to the U.S., and then in exchange, there would be $300 billion of support. Just one thing for another thing, quid pro quo. Since then, it's kind of evolved a little bit, and now he's trying to frame it more, not only as kind of a quid pro quo, but also payback. He's in the past framed Ukraine as having conned the United States out of billions of dollars. And so if he can get Ukraine to sign this agreement, he can kind of frame it then as the U.S. recouping its losses. This could be true, but for me, this is just more evidence that the whole thing is just kayfabe, that the whole thing is bullshit. And transparently so for me, because for one, while it is, I'll concede this, it's difficult to know really what's going to happen because we don't know the details of what's in the agreement. But if I'm right that the agreement does not really involve anything more than superficial concessions, then it's not going to recoup any money at all. It's just going to be a piece of paper. I would point out, though, that even if Ukraine did allow U.S. firms to enter the Ukrainian market and explore for minerals, or for pre-existing minerals that are perhaps owned by the state, give them the rights to extract them, that money would go to those firms for the most part. The only money the U.S. government would get out of it would be whatever tax revenue it collected from those firms, which would probably be very, very small relative to the amount of total U.S. aid that has gone towards Ukraine thus far. So the idea that the U.S. is going to recoup its losses from aiding Ukraine by doing this seems very disingenuous to me. I don't see how that's going to work. Maybe it'll benefit people who are personally connected to Trump. Well-connected elites of one kind or another could get something out of it. Maybe that's how they recoup the money. But that's not going to help the government, right? The bottom line fiscally for the United States would still be in the red as far as money sent to Ukraine as opposed to gotten back in the form of whatever weird mineral agreement they're trying to negotiate here. So the fact that he frames it like this to me is kind of a tacit admission that it's kayfabe, that this is basically just a fake thing that they want to do to try to build public support in the United States for eventually supporting Ukraine later, or maybe for supporting Ukraine as part of a peace deal later, which should be good news if you're pro-Ukraine. But I would add the caveat here that nothing with Trump or the Trump administration is ever certain, so it's really hard to say for sure. So the negotiations themselves over the mineral agreement have kind of been ongoing, on again, off again. There was a time when U.S. representatives were saying the U.S. and Ukraine were, quote unquote, pretty close to signing a deal. Trump again adding that we're going to get our money back. Make of that what you will. But then there was a new tiff. Let me see if I can find the specific quotes here. Oh, a little more on U.S. negotiations and framing here. Quote, the sequencing of what was going to happen was bring the Ukrainians closer to the U.S. through economic ties, convince the economic people, convince the American people, the American public, get them on side, end quote. And that's a quote from Secretary of Treasury Besant. The quote continues, and then tell the Russians to go to the negotiating table with a very fulsome message that if we need to, we will take sanctions up, end quote. So I think, again, that's a tacit admission that, they're kind of doing some kayfabe to build public support and to establish some credibility to their threats in the negotiations. Further evidence that it's kayfabe. Ukraine doesn't actually have that many critical minerals. It doesn't produce any rare earths currently, and it hasn't even had any supplies in decades. Let's see, where's the rest of it? And Zelensky himself noted that it's not a serious conversation, and that Kyiv has gotten $67 billion in weapons and $31.5 billion in direct budget support since the invasion. And that $500 billion then in concessions of minerals would be way, way more than that, and that it would therefore not be an equitable trade. If that is indeed the trade that would happen, which again, I don't think it would actually be.
I know this is late, and I should have said this earlier, but I didn't know what kayfabe was, so I had to look it up during the conversation, and it's been mentioned many times. I looked it up. It's a term used in pro wrestling to describe the act of portraying stage events as real. So, yeah. Kind of like another word for theater, but I guess it's become popularized in the political sphere recently.
Well, specifically vis-a-vis Trump.
Okay.
Because I think kayfabe describes his negotiating style better than just theater. Because theater is kind of, it's meant to be performative. It's meant to kind of appeal to the base, etc. But kayfabe kind of goes beyond that because it requires a partner to participate in it with you. With theater, you're the performer on stage doing a thing. With kayfabe, you've got another performer who's doing it with you that nobody else realizes as a performer. And that's the other critical thing too. Theater, you kind of know it's theater. Even in politics, it's generally pretty transparent. But with kayfabe, everybody involved pretends that it's serious in order to try to fool the audience. So that's a much more accurate portrayal of Trumpian style politics than just saying theater. Theater's been around forever in politics. None of that's new. But Trumpian kayfabe, that kind of is a new thing. And I've started kind of picking up use of the word specifically on that account. It's just more descriptive, more accurate in that sense of what he's doing.
Yeah, and it also seems like while other politicians could practice political theater and point towards certain statements, Trump's style is he will directly say drastic stuff like we want to take Greenland and stuff like that, which is more, I guess, ridiculous or fantasy than most politicians would go so far as to say, at least in terms of a traditional American political style. It's more caution.
Trump tends to go further.
Yeah.
He tends to be more bellicose. He tends to kind of purposely transgress red lines of one kind or another to, violate norms and whatnot. It's a big part of his theater.
But it doesn't seem like there's an underlying plan for a lot of them where he's actually going to make a move towards something. He'll just make some noise in an area to get a reaction out of people, but not really to follow through with the plan and do all the paperwork and go through all the bureaucracy.
Yeah, in that sense, his behavior is consistent with traditional political behavior in the United States. Most don't go as far as he does, but the end objective tends to be ambiguous. Sometimes there's no objective. Sometimes the purpose is the theater itself. Again, for him, it's a show. He's putting on a show for his supporters. There are things that his supporters wanted him to do, and he's putting on a show of himself following through with those things. Doesn't really matter if they actually achieve what he said they would achieve. He's doing them. He's giving the people what they want.
How long until they use actual smoke machines to have political discussions and just add dramatic tension and atmosphere?
Well, if you look at some of the videos they've released, they've already done that.
Oh, okay. So we're there. Nice.
Yeah, well, I'm talking like when he was running for the presidency, you had all of these, campaign videos, which were very dramatic and whatnot. So, the idea of having this kind of theater is not new. But again, for Trump, kayfabe involves other actors. You can't really fully pretend to be fighting for American interests and putting pressure on allies without taking tangible risks. You kind of really have to appear to apply anyways some substantive pressure. But if the counterparty isn't in on it, then there's every possibility that they actually do escalate and then you actually have a real problem, which is not what Trump wants. My impression of his foreign policy strategy over time is that he actually is relatively risk averse when it comes to actual confrontation. So in that sense, he needs dance partners. He needs people who kind of understand implicitly that he doesn't actually want them to fight back, and that he is willing to kind of give ground to a degree. So long as they participate in the kayfabe and help him look strong and good to the public, he's not really going to do much to you.
Gotcha. So as long as he ends up looking like a big scary politician and a king, then he's happy. The end result doesn't matter.
Yeah. And I would point out that, again, like I did earlier, this is normal behavior for presidents in third world countries. Like, they do this very frequently. Not generally with the United States, but, with politicians within their own domestic politics, and occasionally with leaders in their own region. It's not necessarily unusual for them. It varies. Obviously, some are more serious than others, but it's hardly unheard of there. It's just unusual for the United States, and I think that's why some analysts, and if not also some governments around the world, are having so much trouble dealing with them, because they're kind of used to doing presidents the courtesy of taking them seriously. And with Trump, he kind of wants to be taken seriously, but he also kind of doesn't. He kind of wants you to play with him. And that's kind of an awkward position for people in other governments who have taken their jobs very seriously and are not used to that. So let's see, as far as the mineral agreement, so more stuff here. So as I mentioned, Zelensky said no to the mineral agreement as it was presented to him by Secretary of Treasury Besant. How do you pronounce his name? Since then, the negotiations have been ongoing to try to come up with a different agreement. The Trump administration's approach now is to create what they call a simplified minerals agreement first, and then iron out the details later. Once they have an agreement in place, then they could authorize more U.S. aid, or whatever else it is that they were already planning on doing and just wanted an excuse to do. It remains to be seen if Zelensky is actually going to give ground on this, because I think he's still trying to hold out for some kind of substantive concession on the part of the United States. I would point out that Zelensky may be shooting himself in the foot here. If I am right, if this is really just kayfabe, he should just do the dance. He should just make sure that the agreement is a bullshit agreement first, of course. But so long as it is, then just sign it. Just say, oh man, this is a really tough agreement for us, but it's what we have to do. That makes the U.S. government look good, and then they can go and give them whatever aid that they wanted to give them. So this may be a misread by Zelensky here, if he is actually holding out for real tangible concessions for the U.S. here, which I think is one of the reasons why U.S. negotiators have been a little bit upset with them. I think they feel like it should be apparent implicitly that what they're doing is obvious. I think they feel like he should implicitly be able to infer what they want him to do. I think this is one of the problems with the whole kayfabe strategy to negotiating, though, which is that if you come out and just directly tell the other guy that that's what you want to do, there's always the risk that they could say no and then tell everybody that you asked them to do that. So the strategy seems to be never to tell other leaders or negotiating partners that you want to do kayfabe, but just try to leave it to them to infer it. And so that's kind of risky. It seems to be working thus far. But there's always the risk then that it fails eventually. Eventually it will. Something's going to blow up sooner or later. But for now, Zelensky may or may not be kind of in on the joke here. And if he's not, he may miss an opportunity. Let's see. So I think that's all for the mineral agreement for the moment. So that brings us to the most recent stupid thing that happened. Trump made some comments. He's always making comments at a news conference at Mar-a-Lago, which is his basically his what is it? It's like a club, right? I almost said estate, but it's not actually his estate. It's like a club for super wealthy people. He owns it, but he doesn't necessarily live there, although I think he does spend a lot of time there. Anyway, there was a news conference in Mar-a-Lago, and among the comments that he made was kind of implicitly blaming Ukraine for the war. And, the first time I heard that, I, of course, rolled my eyes, because that's a dumb thing to say. And then I kind of watched the video, And he did not explicitly, sorry, excuse me. He did not explicitly say that Ukraine started the war. It was really more of just an offhand comment that he made while he was rambling. And if you've ever seen Trump try to talk to the press or give a speech, you know how he has his rambling style where he just kind of runs around rhetorically and touches on a bunch of random shit, and half of it's bullshit and half of it's obvious pandering, and none of it is real. None of it is just really substantive. It's just him talking, you know, shooting from the hip. And you just kind of learn over time not to take that too seriously. But, you know, some statements do have words, even if you don't think he's being serious. Some things when said do require a response. Like if you say something like just extremely obviously offensive, or that carries real weight, then people affected by that will have to respond. So here what he said was, quote, "I hear that they're upset about not having a seat," talking specifically about the peace negotiations. "Well, they've had a seat for 3 years and a long time before that. This could have been settled very easily. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal." So again, people familiar with Trump know to just kind of ignore that and let him just be long-winded. But Zelensky felt that he had to step in because people were starting to talk about the implication that Ukraine started the war, which, again, is something that Russian misinformation has pushed pretty hard since the war started, if not also before it, referring back to Euromaidan, the Donbass War, etc. So Zelensky responded saying, quote, "We are seeing a lot of disinformation, and it's coming from Russia. With all due respect to President Donald Trump as a leader, he is living in this disinformation space," end quote. That was a bad idea. You know, regardless of whether or not you think Donald Trump is a kayfabe master or not, openly challenging him generally gets a reproach. And some of that can be punishing. So Donald Trump, unsurprisingly, hit back. He said, quote, "Zelensky better move fast or he is not going to have a country left. I love Ukraine, but Zelensky has done a terrible job. His country is shattered, and millions have unnecessarily died." And he said that in the meantime, the U.S. was successfully negotiating an end to the war with Russia, end quote. So that was interpreted by the media as a potential falling out between Zelensky and Trump, and that whatever goodwill may have existed was evaporating, and that if the Trump administration had any intention in the first place of helping Ukraine, that it was certainly gone now. And so that's been the drama for the past 5-6 days, whatever.
Don't you have to be on good terms with someone to have a falling out?
Be on good terms in the first place. Yeah. But again, it was kind of an open question, like where the relationship was at between Zelensky and Trump and between the two governments. Some other fun comments. Trump also said that Zelensky is an unelected dictator, which of course earned a very quick response from leaders in Europe. The Chancellor of Germany, Olaf Scholz, said that it was wrong and dangerous to deny Zelensky's democratic legitimacy. Prime Minister Starmer in the UK called Zelensky directly and said that he backed him fully and that he was the legitimate Ukrainian president. Trump also said that Zelensky only has a 4% approval rating, which is not true. You know, the BBC did a fact check on that. They said that the latest polling suggests that it's around 57% approval, or at least 50%. Specifically, 57% of Ukrainians were found to trust the president. Make of that what you will. So Trump basically just getting mad at Zelensky for saying that he's misinformed or whatever, and then lashing out at him. I think the media overreacted, as they frequently do, especially in the United States. I think he's just running his mouth and that none of this really means anything. But of course, European leaders and certainly Zelensky had to kind of treat it seriously and put out statements to the effect, you know, denying that he's a dictator, you know, et cetera. So, you know, this kerfuffle was totally avoidable. I think Zelensky made the first mistake in making the mistake of taking Donald Trump seriously. That's always the first mistake, it seems. And so I think he's learning the hard way not to do that. I think he should have bit his tongue and just kind of let it go. Let's see, the European Union recently announced some new sanctions. That's just part of a trend of new sanctions announcements. They're generally just going after new shell corporations that are set up by smugglers to get stuff, to bust sanctions, basically, to get stuff that cannot be sold directly to Russia. So, you know, these third-party companies and whatnot, they're set up, they buy stuff in Europe, and then they sell them on to Russia. There's kind of a, what do you call it? hit the mole. What am I thinking of, Neuro?
Whack-a-mole.
Whack-a-mole. Thank you. My brain wasn't cooperating. There's kind of a whack-a-mole game going on with shell corporations, and so whenever you see new sanctions announced, a lot of the times it's just those. The Europeans, for their part, they did announce some new sanctions, legitimately new sanctions, targeting Russian ships that have been illegally transporting oil that has been sanctioned. That's part and parcel of recent announcements, I think at the end of the Biden administration, that they were going to start doing the same thing. So this is basically just the Europeans following suit. Okay, so let's see. Still no details on the minerals agreement, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so yeah, that's pretty much where we are. I think the whole dictator thing is just a sideshow. I think both the Trump administration and the Zelensky administration are just going to forget about that. They're going to sign the minerals agreement, which I think is going to be kayfabe. I don't think anything substantive will come out of that, but it will give the Trump administration a nominal excuse to send more funds to Ukraine and whatnot and to continue aid. And the peace negotiations could go somewhere. I think the Trump administration, I think Marco Rubio and other officials in the State Department specifically are not lying when they say that Europeans and Ukrainians will be consulted in the peace negotiations. I know they don't like being cut out of them entirely, but I think it's a legitimate position to say that direct bilateral negotiations with Russia are not a bad idea. The Biden administration took the view that direct negotiations would just legitimize the conflict, the invasion rather, and that if peace negotiations were to happen, they should be between Putin and Zelensky, specifically between Russia and Ukraine. So that's a fair point to make. It does kind of force the Russians into a position where they have to negotiate directly with Ukraine, and puts the United States in a position where its support to Ukraine is not really on the negotiating table. But at the same time, it also means that the war just kind of dragged out. There wasn't really any clear progression in terms of peace talks because there were no peace talks. So I think it's a fair point to argue that, even if there is some downside to bilateral negotiations, starting them in and of themselves is not necessarily a net bad thing. So I would agree with the Trump administration on that much. That said, I'm still extremely skeptical that Russia is going to agree to anything substantive. I don't think the Russian government feels like it's on the back foot in Ukraine. I think they feel that they have the initiative. They've been taking ground for a while, not very much. It's the pace of progress is extremely slow. But I think that they feel they have the initiative, and more importantly, I think they feel very strongly that the United States does not have any credible threats to make vis-a-vis the Ukraine issue. Because the United States, even during the Biden administration, was pretty clear that it didn't want to jump into the conflict itself. And the Trump administration, well, Trump himself and his team when he was running for election was even more adamant about that. So if the Trump administration doesn't want to take any risks as far as U.S. deployments to Ukraine, I'm not sure what other leverage they have to bring to bear here that didn't already pre-exist. And that being the case, that's why I'm confident that Russia doesn't have any reason to agree to anything and won't. The Trump administration may or may not be genuine in its desire to negotiate some kind of peace or ceasefire. Again, it could just be kayfabe. I think the peace negotiations are more legitimate because peace negotiations are not really that sexy in the grand scheme of things. Big pronouncements that you're going to fuck over your allies and tariffs or, something like that, or calling Zelensky a dictator, that stuff generally makes the rounds in domestic political media. But actual peace negotiations require actual substantive work, and that's the kind of thing that doesn't play as well in media. So I don't think that's real kayfabe. I think they are genuine to some degree that they want a peace agreement. The billion-dollar question is, what kind of agreement do they want? It may well be the case that they have no genuine interest in further support to Ukraine, and that they're going to throw them under the bus. That could still happen. I think some of the signals, including most of the ones I've talked about here, suggest that they're not interested in doing that. I think they do want to continue aiding Ukraine to some degree. But again, the billion-dollar question is to what degree? That's not clear at all. That's something we'll just have to wait to see. Maybe there will be more signals in the next couple weeks, but for now, I don't really feel like I have enough to go on to really make a sound judgment on that.
Yeah, peace negotiations, I feel like, involve a lot of compromise. where both sides have to agree not to get their ideal outcome, and that's hard. And that's the opposite of sexy. The sexy outcome is you get a complete victory of everything that you wanted and then more, and it's just so awesome. But a real peace negotiation usually means that you're also maybe stopping blood feuds, for example, where there has been violence between two sides for some time, and you disagree to stop that or de-escalate that in some way. That means that the people who wanted revenge are not going to get it. So, yeah, it's not an easy thing to do.
Yeah, and Ukraine is particularly concerned because they're afraid that it might, that is to say, the peace deal negotiated might involve them giving up territory and provinces that Russia wants but does not currently occupy. So any deal of that variety would involve the front line, that is to say, the line that Russia controls, moving closer, deeper into Ukrainian territory. But without a security commitment that could deter future Russian aggression, that's just going to mean that Russia basically takes a bunch of territory and then has the launching off point for further offensive operations that's deeper in Ukrainian territory, which obviously is very disadvantageous for them. So they don't want to give up any territory that they feel is just going to end up being used to platform further aggression later. They want to hold on to what they have and preferably get back some of what they lost. Whether or not Moscow is going to be willing to do that, I don't know. I think I've talked before here about how an ideal peace agreement for Ukraine would probably involve some kind of swap. Obviously, Ukraine would have to give up the territory in Kursk that it's taken, but I think it's probably also going to end up giving up territory in territory in Lugansk and Donetsk that it currently controls, but that Russia wants. I think they're going to end up giving that up. And I think they're going to have to end up conceding Crimea. I suspect that in particular is going to be a big ask for Moscow. So not just, giving up on taking it back, but also just ending any claim on it entirely will probably be part of the peace deal. In exchange, I think Ukraine is going to try to get the Russians to evacuate and hand back over Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Kharkiv. In the case of Zaporizhia and Kherson, the Russians occupy about half of them, I think. So they're going to be pretty resistant to leaving. But again, this is an ideal agreement for Ukraine. So I think in an ideal agreement, Ukraine would successfully get the Russians to trade away Donetsk, Lugansk, Crimea, to trade away Zaporizhia and Kherson and Kharkiv in exchange for Donetsk, Lugansk, Crimea. That's probably about as good an agreement as Kiev is going to get. And I want to qualify this by saying that this would not be like a huge defeat for Ukraine. Keep in mind the original Russian aim for the war was to overthrow the government and install a puppet leadership and have a friendly government in Ukraine. And, oh, by the way, annex a bunch of territory probably as well. So any peace agreement in which Ukraine has an independent government that is sovereign and not under Russian control, that's going to be a victory. You could lose way more land, and it would still be a victory if they could get that, because they have very successfully deflected the initial Russian advance, defeated the initial Russian objectives, and I would add shocked the world in doing so. Keep in mind, in the early days of the war, nobody thought Ukraine was going to be able to do shit. The assumption was that the Russian army would steamroll them and that they would roll into Kiev. So Ukraine has a lot to be proud of, and it's regrettable that they will probably end up losing land, but that may just be the price of peace. Hopefully an enduring one in which they have some security commitments. That's the other big thing that Ukraine really wants. But I suspect that they're going to have to come to terms with some unpalatable terms in the peace agreement if and when it comes.
Yeah, they would definitely be skeptical of any promises from Russia, though, given that they had promises before all this.
Yeah, that's why they want the security commitments. That's why Zelensky rejected the mineral agreement at first. He wanted some tangible return in the form of security commitments. Mm-hmm. He wants to know that if Russia attacks again, that there will be help, specifically to deter that from happening. That is to say, to deter Russia from attacking again. If Ukraine can't join NATO and nobody promises to defend them if Russia attacks again, then there's no reason Russia should not just attack again and get what they wanted in the first place. Who's going to help Ukraine again in that case? It's not even clear that there would necessarily be political will to do it again. Keep in mind, even on the part of Western governments when the war started, it's not just the assumption. It was not just assumed that Ukraine would lose the war. It was almost kind of preferred. Because if there was a big war that would see proxy conflict between Russia and Ukraine, Russia and the West rather, that would mean big disruption in terms of Europe's energy markets. And that's exactly what happened. But I mean to say here that Europe and the United States kind of low-key preferred Ukraine to just kind of lose the war quickly in order to minimize disruption. As we've talked about before, the West had effectively conceded Ukraine as a part of Russia's sphere of influence before 2014 even. That was why 2014 and why 2022 was even possible. Russia just wasn't satisfied with that because they wanted more. Specifically, they weren't satisfied with the West saying that, we're not going to completely rule out NATO membership, but we're also not going to admit them for 10 years, 20 years, or maybe just even ever. Also, domestic political considerations in Russia are a heavily discounted, undersold motivation for the war. That was, like I mentioned before, domestic political considerations are generally the most important driver of major foreign policy decisions in most any country. And in Russia's case, no different. They had big protests in Russia 2019, 2011. It was kind of a rising tide of discontent in many ways. And the Russian government kind of felt that heat and took a number of steps in order to try to mitigate that. And I feel like the war in Ukraine in 2014 and 22 was among those steps. And again, I think they felt that both wars, both the 2014 intervention and the 22 invasion, would be short, victorious wars. I don't think they had any concept that either conflict would be dragged out as much as it has been. So, they felt that Ukraine did not have real allies in the West that would really help them. They were largely right in that. And they felt that their own military was capable enough to make any intervention relatively successful and short and costless. That being the case, I feel like that pretty well explains the Russian reasoning in Moscow. I think the NATO argument is a sideshow because I don't think, we've argued about this before. I shouldn't say argue about it, but I've talked about this before. The Russians never really felt that threatened by the NATO membership thing because I feel like they knew tacitly that it wasn't really going to happen. Not happen for a long time, probably not happen ever, because the West was deeply skeptical about expanding NATO further, didn't really want confrontation with Russia, and was pretty okay with the status quo. So that being the case, I don't feel like Russian pronouncements that they were genuinely threatened by NATO expansion were ever genuine. I'm sure there are Russian nationalists and individual Russians who took it seriously. What I'm saying here is that actual foreign policy folks in the Russian government, in the actual foreign policy establishment in Russia, ever took that seriously. I don't think that's true. I don't think they ever did. For them, it's just leverage.
Yeah, well, it would make sense to try to involve a country in NATO that would increase the security commitments that NATO would have to, shelter Ukraine more so for little benefit to themselves. It's too risky of a venture for it to sound attractive.
Yeah, that was basically the gist of it. Also, it was also the other criticism was that NATO was already just so big, and so many European states were not really spending a lot on defense, which meant that the burden was disproportionately on the United States. So why have another freeloader then? So the realist argumentation went. Mm-hmm. I don't entirely agree with that argumentation, but that's what it was, and it was a fair argument. Even if I don't agree with it, I recognize that it has some legitimacy. So, yeah. That's where it was, and it's specifically because of that fecklessness on the part of the West, that unwillingness to really commit one way or the other to NATO membership or not NATO membership, that they want a security commitment so much now. Because if they had had that before, none of the intervention in 2014, the war in 2022, none of that would have happened if they'd had a firm security commitment, either in the form of NATO or otherwise. So Kiev now is absolutely adamant about that. Their feeling is that any agreement that does not involve security commitments is a bullshit agreement that is just going to result in aggression later, probably shortly later, not even that long an amount of time after the agreement is implemented. Mm-hmm. So, I've seen people argue that Ukraine isn't serious about ending the war. I think there was even somebody in chat who said that last time. That's absolutely wrong. They're fighting, for one, they're fighting every day to end the war. They're not fighting just for fun, right? They're fighting for their sovereignty, for their future, etc. So every day fought at the front is a day fought to end the war on favorable terms. But more to the point, Ukraine feels earnestly, Ukrainians, the Ukrainian government, Zelensky, etc., all of them feel earnestly that they're just going to have to fight this war later without a security commitment. And if that's the case, it's better to just fight it now in order to try to maximize their leverage in the peace negotiations. Because they're just going to be weaker later if they put it off. Because invariably, whatever peace agreement is going to have, whatever peace agreement is implemented is probably going to involve some degree. Well, maybe disarmament. The Russians are demanding disarmament on the part of the Ukrainian army, not full disarmament, but reducing it down to less than half of its current size. I would point out that the Russians have not conceded any corresponding disarmament on their part, so you can guess what that would do to the balance of power between the two armies. That just sets Ukraine up for failure later. But even if there's not disarmament, even if disarmament is not in the agreement, there's probably going to be some downsizing after the war, just because the Ukrainian budget is absolutely fucked right now, right? Their economy is struggling. It's gotten a little better over the past year, but by and large, they still need lots of foreign support in order to fund all of this. And if the war does end, probably a good chunk of that funding is going to disappear. I know there's been a lot of talk about reconstruction funding and all that and trying to make that work. But they're going to have to make cuts invariably. They'll try to avoid making cuts to the army, but some degree of cuts is probably unavoidable, especially in terms of conscripts. The core of the army will remain there. They'll probably try to build that up, in fact. But having shit tons of conscripts and volunteers and whatnot, they'll probably push those people out to save money, would be my guess. And that will put them in a weaker position later on. So their goal has to be in the short term to get as favorable an agreement as possible, and that means security commitments. Because they're never going to be stronger in peace negotiations than they are right now. Any end of the war is not going to change that. A ceasefire is not going to change that. I've heard people argue that a ceasefire would give not only Russia but also Ukraine a chance to build up its forces and become a porcupine, is the exact analogy I've heard. Just make them a porcupine that is just so tough that it deters future aggression. That is absolute horseshit.
They just lob artillery at stuff. It doesn't matter if it's a porcupine if you're lobbing artillery at it.
Yeah, that's the thing. You can only fortify so much, and Ukraine only has so many resources with which to fortify. So invariably, however tough they may be, the Russians aren't going to be deterred by that. They're not going to be deterred by mere conventional Ukrainian forces. There's going to have to be some assistance. And if that's not there, then the Russians will not be deterred, and it's as simple as that. Any agreement that doesn't take that into consideration is dead on arrival.
We did have Bitter Sugar tune in, I think, 2 days ago, just checking out the stream and watching some of the Dota and stuff, and he seemed pretty sad about the overall state of things, like after I've heard you say what Trump has said about Zelensky and so on, just feeling kind of disrespected and not really considered an ally or a partner that's deserving of some kind of support or a deal. It's been more so, why'd you get yourself in this situation? So they don't really feel super supported right now, but strength to them and determination to the Ukrainian people. I know it's a lot to go through. Most people, like ourselves, we've never been in a situation where our country is being invaded, so it's hard to imagine what that's like. But yeah, it's one of those conflicts that it's been going on this whole time. We started talking about it in 2022, and Crimea happened before then. So bit of a mess. We'll see how it goes, but it's a very slow grind.
Well, to Bitter Sugar and any other Ukrainians who might be listening, I would say that there's definitely been a lot of drama. There's definitely been a lot to be angry about, to be disappointed by. But as I pointed out, most of this has just been theater, and I think the overall trajectory that the Trump administration has laid out in its early signals vis-a-vis its intentions in Ukraine is actually fairly positive for you. That could change very quickly. You never can tell fully with the Trump administration, but I would say overall, you have reason for optimism. I don't think he's going to pull the plug, for example, as some people were worrying about earlier. I think the signals early on are that they're not going to do that. So I think the administration is relatively favorable to Ukraine. I don't think they're going to say that openly. I think they're going to say lots of stupid shit that you're not going to like, as we've seen. But I think that's mostly just politics for domestic political consumption in the United States, and also to generate some leverage in the negotiations. So don't take it too seriously. Wait to see what they do, not what they say. That's good advice with regard to the Trump administration and almost any issue.
Cheers. Well, cool. That is a nice full session. Thanks for going through the questions and catching us up on the world. Ladies and gentlemen, appreciate your viewership, your support, and your chat. Thank you, Fuzzy Cord, for handling questions. Thank you, Agent Smith, for your expertise. And we will see you all on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah, thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG.